Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to the Coach Ben Z podcast, Ask Coach Ben podcast. Today I have Mr. Chris Allsopp. He is the owner of MMA Betting Tips.com. And did I get that right? MMA Betting
Yeah,
Tips.com.
perfect. Thanks.
And he also has a YouTube channel called Diary of a Professional Gambler. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. And I found out about Chris basically online, and I'm gonna tell the story of how I found him in a little bit, but I wanted to give him an opportunity to kind of introduce himself because this is somewhat new to my platform. I usually have fitness nutrition advice, but Chris is a professional gambler and he specializes in betting on MMA. So we're gonna talk for a while. I really want to get deep into this topic, and I'm just gonna let you introduce yourself, Chris. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm a professional gambler. I only bet on MMA. Started gambling around about 15 years ago, but really started to get into MMA around about 10 years ago. So to become a professional gambler, it wasn't something that I tried to become. It was just something that I fell into. So I found myself staying up late every night watching the fights. And I used to just bet like £5 per fight. And then I found that, some weeks I'd make a little bit of money, some weeks I'd make a small loss, but usually I'd float around break even. And then I thought, what would happen if instead of doing that, I just focused on betting fighters that I felt super confident would win. And from there, it just built up and up and up over time over the last 10 years. So I turned pro around about 4 years ago, um, a year after I set up my website. So, yeah, it's pretty much my story.
Awesome. So you have a subscription service, right? So you
Hmm.
offer a subscription service where you give out your betting advice. You have two memberships. One is the just kind of like the regular membership where you give out your pre-fight tips, which are fights that you can bet either, I guess, in person if you're in the places that you can, and but mostly online. Most of your subscribers are online bettors. Is that correct?
Hmm. Yeah, that's
Um,
right. Yeah.
and then your other service is your elite membership, and that's the one where you offer your live tips, and that's the one I'm a
Hmm.
part of, and it's full right now, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's really it's a strange business to be in. So people always ask, if you can make money from betting on MMA, why would you even need to sell this kind of service in the first place? But I think it's one of these things where it's kind of like a dirty secret in the betting industry that not a lot of people know. So obviously the vast majority of people that bet on MMA or bet on any sport actually lose. So they never get to the stage where they're consistently making money from these betting websites. And what people don't realize is when you do consistently start to make money, the betting sites will close you down, and then it becomes very difficult to place your own bets. So that's why I set up the website and this service. A little bit was to kind of get back at the bookies because I thought, well, if you're not going to let me make money, I will help other people make money from you. And at the same time, it was to give me a stable income because I do obviously make money from gambling myself, but there's no consistency to it because you never know when you might get closed down. So it makes it really difficult to plan from month to month roughly how much you can expect to earn. But live betting MMA is a tricky sport for betting because it's what you call like a low liquidity sport where not much money is actually bet on the sport compared to other sports, and that's why if you do consistently make money betting on MMA, you tend to get closed down a lot faster than you would on other sports, just because there's not as much money in the MMA betting market. And live betting on MMA is even worse because it's an even smaller niche to MMA betting, if that makes sense. So that's why we have to put a cap on the number of members that we've got, because the way that the MMA betting markets work, or any sports betting market, basketball, ice hockey, anything, is the way that the odds move will depend on how much money is being bet on each team or each fighter. So if you've got a bunch of people all trying to bet the same thing at the same time, the odds will rapidly decline or become suspended. So that's why I limit the number of people to a small number so that everyone can still get bets in and make money without the odds getting absolutely destroyed.
I
So
see. So we're talking mainly about online betting right now. So I'm from
mhm.
the U.S. You are from Wales, I believe.
Hmm.
Wales.
Yeah, yeah.
So for me in the U.S. and most of the people that listen to my stuff, we're all from the U.S. When it comes to U.S. betting, I first got into online betting MMA when it was a Bodog, right? It used to be a site called Bodog. It's now
Hmm.
called Bovada, I believe. And back then, I didn't know nothing. I was just putting down bets, and I thought I knew how to bet on fighters. But anyway, the point I was going to make was in the U.S. So one of the struggles of being in the U.S. is that there are not a lot of online betting sites that take customers from the U.S. I believe there's Five Dimes, there's Bet DSI, there's Bet Online, and then there's Bovada. And of those, and those are for people that live in most of the U.S. If you live in New Jersey or if you live in Las Vegas, then you have a much bigger just bunch of sites to choose from. But you have to live there. I don't live there. I live in California, Los Angeles. So um, the point I was making was it's harder for people in the U.S. to bet online on MMA, and it gets even harder when you're doing live betting because in live betting there's only really two sites that offer it, right? It's Bet DSI and then there's Five Dimes that lets you bet in between rounds. So it's tough for people in the US to bet online, but to be honest, I thought it would be a problem, but I don't really see it as a problem because I'm not betting the amounts that are, that would affect the liquidity. It's a couple $100 here and there. I'm, not betting, a whole lot. I guess what I'm getting to is what are the amounts that you're betting pre-fight, so before the fight starts, and then live during the fight. Can you give us a ballpark figure of how much you're betting?
Yeah, so the problem is if you're managing your money correctly, all bets, the amount that you're betting on each fight or anything you're betting on should be relative. So, for example, some fights will have much more liquidity than others. So, if you were talking about a fight like Donald Cerrone against Tony Ferguson this past weekend, because so much money will have been bet on a fight like that, if you wanted to, you could bet a huge amount of money. It probably wouldn't be a problem to bet like 50,000 to $100,000 on a fight like that. But if you wanted to bet, for example, one of the first fights in the night, like Bevon Lewis against Darren Stewart, or if you wanted to bet on a Bellator fight, it's taking place this evening, it's very difficult to bet, even $5,000 to $10,000 on a betting site. On one specific betting site, it would be impossible to bet that amount. You'd have to split it up into smaller amounts and bet like 500 here, 1,000 there. So the danger of that is you want all bets to be relative. So because the amount that you should be betting should be relatable to your confidence level, you need to make sure that you're able to bet just as much on the first prelim fight as you would on a high liquidity main card fight. And that's what makes it difficult to grow your bankroll and make large amounts. So, say for example, try to think of an example of a bet where. I won't use specific bet examples, but say you felt not that confident that Donald Cerrone would win this past weekend, but you could bet $100,000 on him, absolutely no problem. And then say on this upcoming card, Kevin Aguilar's fighting Dan Ige, and you felt super confident that Kevin Aguilar would win. You can bet 100 grand on Cerrone, but you might struggle to bet 10 or 20 grand on Aguilar. So it's relative though. Do you see what I mean? So even though you can bet a lot on some fights, you've got to keep it all in the same ballpark. So to ensure I do keep things all in the same ballpark, I'm betting between $1,000 and $10,000 per fighter because I know the chances are, whether I feel super confident in someone or not that confident, either way I'll be able to get the amount of money down that I want, and it'll all be relative. Because what you don't want to do is go and bet $100,000 on someone like Cerrone that you may not feel that confident on and get absolutely destroyed. And then on all the bets you do feel confident on, they may come on the prelims or fight night cards with not that much liquidity, and it would take you a long time to
Right.
make that amount back. So it's important to keep things relative. And also because obviously there are very strict max bet limits in live betting, you need to keep the amount you're betting in live betting relative to the amount you're betting on pre-fight betting as well, so that you're not placing an abnormally large amount of money on one fight. It needs to all be relative. And by doing that, even though you won't in inverted commas, win as much because you won't have these huge paydays. It's a great way to manage risk because you're not ever taking one huge hit on one specific fight. Because people have a perception that, you can just, if you know a lot about gambling, you know a lot about MMA, you should be able to pick out fights and fire big on them and make a lot of money. But it's actually just a volume game. You're not trying to be right or wrong in any one specific fight. You're trying to place 500 or 600 bets throughout a year and win a hell of a lot more than you lose. But you don't know on any given night what the winners and losers are going to be. So it's really important to keep all bet sizes relative. So that's why I stick to $1,000 to $10,000, because no matter what the liquidity is, I know I'll be able to get money down, and I'll avoid the big swings by doing it that way.
Cool. And I wanted to
I
just,
hope that makes sense.
yeah, I get it, but I want to clear up a few terms. So, first of all, is it possible to bet $100,000 online? Is that even possible?
It wouldn't be easy, and it definitely wouldn't be easy. It's possible, but it would be very difficult. So it wouldn't be possible in the United. It probably would. It wouldn't be possible in the United States because you have such a limited amount of betting sites to work with. But you think like globally, well, in
Right,
Europe, Australia,
through many
yeah.
sites. So not
So
on one
there
site.
is, yeah, no, would not be possible on one site at all. No site. I mean, even if you were the max bet limits are usually determined by the what. So the bookies will basically score your account on how much of a risk they believe you are to costing them money. So there's certain, I won't go into it now because it's a
Uh-huh.
very big topic,
Right.
but depending on how likely it is that they think you will cost them money, depends on how much they'll let you bet. So this is why, sometimes I'll say, it's really hard to bet on such and such fighter. I could only bet, say, 5 grand, and someone else will pop that line and I can bet 50 grand. And the reason is they profile that account and they'll say, if this person is very unlikely to if this person is very unlikely to cost us money, we'll take a big bet from them. If it's likely they will cost us money, we'll limit our risk and only take a small bet. It's like the casinos in Vegas, where if you're a high roller and you're really reckless and you go there all the time and lose millions of dollars, they'll let you play on the craps tables or blackjack or roulette with unlimited limits. Whereas if you're just some guy that walks off the street, they don't know who you are. They will make you play on the regular tables because they don't know what you're capable of. You're too much of a risk to them. And betting sites will profile gambling accounts in that way. And this is one of the benefits. Everything in life's got strengths and weaknesses. So in the United States, you guys are at a disadvantage because you don't have as many betting options. But the beauty is the betting sites that you do have are nowhere near as sophisticated as the sites in the rest of the world. So, the websites in the rest of the world are using like AI and machine learning to kind of profile people in this way. Whereas the sites in the US are very basic. They don't have these kind of technologies. So it's possible to go undetected and make much more money. It's possible not to get limited as fast as you would in Europe and Australia. And they don't profile accounts in the same way. So the kind of stuff I'm saying really mainly applies to European, Canadian, Australian sites. But yeah, in American
That's
sites,
interesting.
a
So
lot different.
I didn't think that's a pretty big deal then. So one
Hmm.
other question I had was, I kind of understand this term, but can you describe liquidity in
Hmm.
betting? Can you just define
Sure.
that?
Yeah, so the best way to describe it is describing it in like the context of stocks and shares or cryptocurrency, because betting is just a different kind of financial market. It's not seen as that. People see it as a form of gambling and entertainment, but at its rawest form, you are betting on the outcome of something. Just like when you buy a stock or a share or a cryptocurrency or a commodity, you are betting on the fact that what you've bought will go up in value. A bet, whether you're placing a bet on a sport or you're buying a stock or share, is exactly the same thing. So when we talk about liquidity, obviously the bigger the market that you're getting involved in, the more chance that there's going to be that someone on the other side has an opposite opinion to you. And if you want to buy something, if there's a big market with a lot of people buying and selling, if you want to sell something or buy something, there's going to be someone on the other side that wants to sell you a product or buy what you're selling from you. And liquidity is exactly the same. So, for example, if you look at like penny stocks, which not many people are interested in some penny stocks, if you held a large amount of penny stocks and you wanted to sell them, you might not be able to because there aren't enough people willing to buy. Does that make sense? It's the same with
Yeah, yeah.
cryptocurrency. It's driven by supply and demand. So gambling markets are exactly the same. You have a set amount of money on either side. So imagine if you have, say, you have a fighter. We'll use an example. Lyoto Machida's fighting Chael Sonnen later on tonight. So Machida's a big favorite. I think he's currently around about 1.25, which I think is like minus 400. So the bookies need a lot more money bet on Machida than on Chael Sonnen because Chael Sonnen's a big underdog. So that if Sonnen were to win, there would be enough money in the pot from people betting Machida to pay out on Sonnen. That's basically how liquidity works.
I see.
And what happens is the more money you get bet on either fighter, the odds will change to balance out. So, for example, the reason why Machida's a big favorite is because so many more people have bet him, which has pushed the price down. So it's exactly like when a lot of people go to buy Bitcoin or shares in Tesla. The more people buy in, the price goes up. It's the opposite in betting. The more people that bet on a fighter, the price goes down, the odds go down. But it's really a balancing act for the bookies. So you'll often see when fighters are at dead even, if you think of in terms of probabilities, fighters being at dead even, the odds should roughly be 2.0 each plus 100, right? Because that's 50-50 each, equal payout on each fighter. But the way the bookies do things, they will just leave themselves a margin. So if ever you see a fight that is dead even, it won't actually be 2.0, 2.0 plus 100 plus 100. It'll be 1.91, 1.91 minus 110, minus 110. Because what that means is if the bookies have capped it as even, they believe it to be a 50-50 outcome, they'll leave themselves a margin so that whoever wins or loses, they'll make a profit of, say, 5-10%. And it's called the VIG. That's how it works. But that's what liquidity is. It's the total amount of money bet on a fight, and the bookies really don't care who wins. They're just trying to balance their books.
They're
So
gonna
whoever
make money
wins,
no matter what, right?
exactly.
They just care
Yeah,
about how much money's in the pot, so that
yeah,
they're not gonna, like, say if there's only $1,000 in the pot, they're not gonna take a bet for $5,000 from one side, right? That's kind of how
exactly.
they wouldn't. That's why you would have a betting limit on a fight, for example.
Yeah. So what I notice, it's quite frustrating to do what I do because the bookies are really clever. They're really smart the way they do things. So they don't actually really set very good odds on MMA at all. You know, if you want to make a lot of money, the way to do it is by exploiting the early odds on fights on MMA because when you see the initial odds that get released, they're just completely inaccurate. They're ludicrous. And people will rush out and
Can
bet
you give me a
the
couple
opening odds.
examples? Can you give everybody a couple examples of the initial ludicrous
Uh,
odds?
Well, if you look at Renato Moicano, who's fighting Korean Zombie on the next event, he opened up at odds of around 1.80, which is minus 125, and he's now down to around about 1.44, which is minus 227. So that's like a 50% drop in odds in just a space for 2 weeks. And the reason why bookies do it is they basically put initial odds out just into the market. But what they'll do is they will put the opening odds out, but they will set super low max bet limits. So when the odds first come out on any MMA fight, the maximum you can usually bet is $250. And then every time you bet $250 or the cumulative total of bets reaches $250 on that fighter. So for example, if I was to bet $100 and you were to bet 150, once that $250 max bet limit has been reached, the odds would then decline and improve on the other fighter. And that's why we see when these opening odds get released, the odds get destroyed and inaccuracies get corrected very quickly because they set the max bet limit so low that they let the betting public do their work for them and correct their odds at a very low price, which is
Right.
genius,
They're
really.
smart.
But
They're
yeah,
trying to protect, if somebody, here's another example. So I was looking earlier, so tonight Dylan Dennis is fighting. His odds have
hmm
shifted so far into the have declined so far into it's unbettable at this point. I mean, even
Hmm.
if you thought
Hmm.
he had a 90% chance of winning, I don't think you can bet this, right? It's minus 1450 right now for Dylan Dennis. You know, he started at minus, I think it was like 300, 400, and then it just shifted, right? So would that be an
Hmm.
example of what you're describing? Just like people putting too much money on one side and shifting the odds?
Yeah. So what's really funny is there are obviously odds for months in advance, but as a professional gambler, I have to wait until very close to the time of the fights before I can place my own bets or I can recommend a bet to my community. I wanted to bet Renato Moicano 2 weeks ago. I researched that fight a couple of weeks ago. I think he wanted to bet Moicano at odds of 1.80 minus 125. He was a great bet. But I can't do anything until liquidity improves. Because if liquidity is low, as soon as you go to try and bet a large amount of money on him, two things are going to happen. You're either not going to be able to because max bet limits are so low, or if you did and you consistently made money from these kind of bets, the betting sites would close you down very fast because it would be a sign that you're exploiting inaccurate odds, which they don't like. If we talk about betting sites profiling the probability that you will cost them money, placing bets very far in advance and taking advantage of inaccuracies is a clear sign that you know what you're doing. The betting sites want impulsive people, dumb gamblers. They don't want intelligent people who have done their homework, taking calculated risks, and that's another reason why it's uh, it's very risky to bet these opening odds because on one hand you do make money from them because they're inaccurate, but on the other side of the coin, you're kind of waving a flag to the
You
bookies
expose yourself, basically, right?
to say, "Bet me." Yeah, yeah. So, for example, we're both going to be betting on Bellator straight after we do this podcast, Bellator 222. And the beauty of MMA betting is that bookies have to increase their max bet limits eventually. So, for example, the max bet limits on fight day will be the highest that they've been because by fight day, so much more money has come in and been bet on the fighters. Liquidity is built up, so it's less scary for them to take big bets because they know there's enough money on the other side to balance things out. So if we look at Bellator 222 tonight, so we've got a great bet on Bellator tonight. Eduardo Dantas opened up at around 3.0 plus 200. Um, and those odds are just completely ridiculous. Like I don't even know what to say. They're just
His
so
odds have
inaccurate.
been
Like anyone
killed.
that would have researched.
They've gone
That's
down
what
a
I mean.
lot. Yeah, when you recommended that bet for Eduardo Dantes, he was like plus 160 or plus 175 or something. Now he's plus,
Hmm.
I mean he's plus 110 on some sites. But yeah, I mean your other bet I think is good too. And then just like a lot of these I understand exactly what you're saying, and hopefully the audience understands too, is basically you cannot put a lot of money in on opening odds because there's low liquidity and you're kind of waving a flag telling the betting sites, hey, I know that I'm smarter than you, and now you
Exactly.
you should shut me down or restrict my betting limits because I do my research. They want, like you said, they want the dummies who are
Hmm.
parlaying 15 fighters with hockey and basketball in it and betting
Hmm.
on and betting on things like cowboy by knockout in the first round.
Hmm.
Let's real quick. So I want to shift gears real quick and kind of talk about this is a question I've been meaning to ask you, and I wanted you to elaborate on this. And you once said, I forgot where I heard you say it, probably in one of your YouTube shows, that with your experience as a high level gambler, or your example was you used like Daniel Negreanu, who's a very high level poker player, um, and then that would be one side, and you put him in a competition, a betting competition, MMA, against Faraz Zahabi or a high level MMA coach, and you said that the professional gambler would almost always destroy the professional MMA coach in betting MMA or making money in MMA. And the reason you said was because of money management, but I wanted you to elaborate on why. So Faraz would lose to even you, I would say, in betting on MMA. Why?
So I think the reason why a lot of people lose money when it comes to sports betting is because they assume if they know a lot about that sport, they should be able to win a lot of bets and make money. But I think a lot of people ignore the fact that gambling is a skill in itself. It is not easy to gamble and bet in a way to turn a profit. So if we look at it in like the context of MMA, it's no different to if you wanted a high level MMA coach or fighter to be an MMA journalist, or if you wanted them to be like an MMA photographer or a commentator, or all the examples that we can use. Just because someone knows a lot about how to fight doesn't necessarily mean they'll know a lot about a skill relating to fighting. And gambling, if you were to take like a high level coach or a fighter and you were to give them a set amount of money, they would have no idea how to manage that money. They'd have no idea how to gauge risk. They'd have no idea how to deal with losing streaks. They would have no idea how to kind of drown out the self-talk, because we've all got confirmation bias. It's hardwired into all of us. They wouldn't know how to silence the confirmation bias. What information should I pay attention to? What should I not pay attention to? It's just
Control
so
their
many factors.
emotions.
Exactly. It's gambling is a skill in itself. So when I say that, I'm not being disrespectful to any fighters or coaches. I'm not saying I know more about MMA than coaches or fighters. I'm just saying that in the context of gambling, it's a completely different skill, because the thing that I think a lot of people overlook is that MMA is such an unpredictable sport. There's no way on any given night to predict who's going to win. All you can do is get your money into strong positions, and then over time you will make a profit. And not understanding that concept, I think will get most people into a lot of trouble, because they'll get frustrated. They won't know how to dig themselves out of big losing streaks, which will happen. Whereas an experienced gambler like a Daniel Negreanu, he's got his stripes. He's spent thousands of hours on the poker table dealing with extreme swings, dealing with the worst luck imaginable, like odds defying luck. And he's got the mentality required to overcome that. Whereas the average person that doesn't gamble at that high level wouldn't be able to overcome these challenges. So that's all it is, really.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it, and anybody who's has any critical thinking ability should understand what you're saying, right? You can be a great coach, but not there's different it's a game inside of a game. And I wanted to get to this next was you've we've spoken before, and you don't have any experience in combat sports as far as like being a coach or being a fighter or a martial artist or training the sport, for example, right? But you've made a tremendous amount of money betting on MMA and watching fights. So that was the one thing that like really fascinated me when I first kind of found out about you, was that thing was how could somebody who doesn't train in MMA and coach fighters and just watches fights know so much about him. Like you've said things in your live stream that I've heard, and I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. And then it happens. I don't think, and then all of a sudden the thing you said happens, and it's crazy to me because I coach fighters. I'm Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I know fighting. I've been watching MMA since, you know, I would say like UFC 3. So I don't see these things that you can see. And that maybe in my head I'm thinking maybe I'm not looking at the right things, whereas you are, and maybe I know too much about the sport in the technical aspects, and I'm not thinking about it from a making money and from a judge's standpoint, from who's winning the fight, who's actually winning the fight. I'm too thinking about things that don't matter in the context of betting, and that's why I think you're really good at what you do, and you don't have to. And for anybody out there who and I've heard this all the time, people say, oh, if you haven't been in there to do it, then you don't know anything. That's completely rubbish. Like you're a winning uh, MMA better that has not coached MMA or stepped, into a fight or anything. And I can guarantee you that there's a ton of people that have done MMA and coach MMA at a high level, and they probably lost way more than they won. So that to me was huge, and it was like an eye-opening thing. And it made me, think about how little I knew of the sport from a bigger picture. And I said earlier I was going to tell the story of how I found you. I think I told you before. Did you? Do you remember? You remember?
I think so.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
it
So
was in
I'll.
the chat room though, so it
Yep.
won't be
It's
as
not.
cool.
Yeah.
I think.
But I'll tell the story, and I actually have some questions off of the story. So,
Okay.
Mickey Gall is a fighter that I work with. I love Mickey. He gave me my first opportunity to work with a fighter, an active fighter in the UFC in person. You know, I worked with a lot of fighters online, you know, distance. And I never work with them personally. You know, I work with a lot of amateurs, a lot of pro boxers, but Mickey was the guy who got me kind of into working with an MMA fighter who was signed to the UFC, who was a main carder, who had a big name in the industry. And so I was with Mickey in his camp, his fight with Diego Sanchez, and I was basically just trolling around online looking for odds on the fight because I was like, you know, some idiot's gonna say Diego's favored, and lo and behold, I found your site because of this, and look, I'm open-minded, so is Mickey. We're all, you know, we're all looking to better ourselves. I don't mind any criticism, but I was honestly offended by the
Oh no,
odds
I'm
that
really
you set.
sorry.
No. It's not personal. Like in hindsight, it was one of the greatest things that could happen because it exposed a lot of things wrong with my thinking, and also, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to help Mickey too because it's gonna be able to kind of, you know, I want to ask you some technical things too. But anyway, so the story continues. I went online and I found your site through that, and you had this big breakdown of why you know, Diego was going to win, and you're putting a big bet on it. It was like 3 units, and I know you don't work in units, but 3 unit bet is a big bet, right? For you, I believe
Yeah, yeah.
the biggest bets I've ever seen from you was Diego against Mickey, and then
Hmm.
Adesanya against Kelvin. So for this
Hmm.
bet, you put 3 units on 3 units is basically 3% of your bankroll if that's if you use units, and you put a big bet on Diego to win at tremendous odds. By the way, I think he was like a plus 300 or something like that, or something similar, right?
Hmm.
And you had all this breakdown, and when I initially looked at it, you know, I'm emotional, I'm biased. You know, I work with the guy. I was
Hmm.
like, there's
100%.
no way this is gonna happen. I'm gonna show up in this chat room the day after the fight, and I'm going to just talk about how ridiculous it was. And you know, now that I've read that breakdown like 4 times now, it's pretty much exactly how you wrote it. And that's basically how I found you. I was like, you know, how did this guy know? Like, how did he know? Because in my head, there was no way Mickey was going to lose. You know, I trained with him. You know, I consider myself a high-level jiu-jitsu black belt. He submits me like nothing. You know, I can hang with him for like 2 rounds, and then it's just getting tapped at will. So I thought there was no way. And then you put stuff in there like that I look back on, and I'm like, you know what? That's 100% correct. So that's kind of how I found you. And and I'm just going to ask you straight up, if you were Mickey, because Mickey's still my guy, what would you have done to prepare for the Diego fight? What would you do going forward from an outside
I, I
perspective?
think I think that like Mickey Gall's got a base to be an amazing fighter. Like he's still young, he's tough, he's obviously got a super high level ground game. But the problem with MMA, so many MMA fights are decided by position, and I think that's like one of Mickey's biggest weaknesses. So I think if Mickey could just tighten up his takedown defense, he would be way more effective because then he would be able to initiate the grappling exchanges and lead position and dictate where the fight takes place. Whereas at the moment, with his current style, because he's so happy to fight off his back, he's very reactive to where his opponents put him. And I think that's just been the biggest thing that's cost him. You know, his fight against Randy Brown was probably the best example of it, where he spent so much time off his back fishing for submissions without which is difficult to watch because 9 times out of 10, if you're on your back in MMA, you're in a losing position. Whereas instead of fishing for submissions, if he would have instead worked for reversals and just tried to just cruise to an easy decision win, just control Randy Brown from top position. There's no question he was at a much higher level than Randy Brown
He had his back
on the
at one
ground.
point. Yeah, just couldn't. It was
Yeah,
too late.
much higher level than Randy Brown. There's no doubt about that. But it's one of those things. I'm not sure who came up with the term in MMA, but I absolutely love it. It's position over submission.
That's a
I'm
jiu-jitsu
only
thing.
ever focused. Like in my mind, I'm only ever focused on a win, right? So I'm always working in like probabilities and wins. So it's really difficult to get a finish in MMA. You know, to submit or knock your opponent out is difficult. The easiest path to victory is just controlling everything that happens and winning a decision. So I love the expression position over submission, because in my mind, you should always just be thinking about pacing yourself so that you can fight effectively for 15 minutes. If a finish comes, that's great, but the most important thing should just be putting your stamp on every round so that the judges can't take the fight away from you and you're guaranteed a win. Because it's like that. It's like that other expression that comes from boxing, isn't it? When you put yourself in a position to finish your opponent, quite often, when you go to finish your opponent, quite often you're putting yourself in a position to also be finished. And that's just like the biggest thing. But again, it's just experience. I guarantee he'll probably never fight like that again.
Yeah,
You know?
that was only his. I think it was like his sixth fight. I think he's 5-3, and it's his
Hmm.
eighth fight, something like that. But yeah, that the point of me bringing that up was I wanted to get your perspective on it, and also just for everybody listening, Mickey did explain a little. He did have a little bit of a health issue there. I'm not. We can't say if it would have affected him in the fight. He said he felt good, but I was with him the week of the fight, and he was having stomach issues, and he ended up getting rhabdo, which is very serious. We're not sure if it happened before or after the fight, but anyway, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what happened in your breakdown happened, and I could see it happening whether if he was healthy or not. No, all respect to Diego, we underestimated him to a certain degree, and a healthy Mickey may have done better, but it doesn't change the fact that I saw him do a lot of the moves that he planned on doing, and Diego was just there. His grappling was
Hmm.
at a high level, and the guy's been training like a savage for 10 years, and so anyway, that was like my first introduction to you is from looking online, and
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing.
yeah,
That's really, really
I
cool.
thought it was cool because I see it as a positive thing. It happened. It's already done. I learned from it. I found you through this. We're doing a podcast. Mickey will be out here soon. We're going to work on a lot of the things. I'm going to do a strength conditioning. We're going to put all our work into that. Um, we're gonna move on. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
I know you said sorry, but thank you for putting that out, because that, I probably learned more from just that experience than like years of coaching fighters. Just thinking, don't let your emotions and biases get in there. That's the one thing in betting that I have trouble with personally is, and I'm sure everybody listening and everybody that bets on MMA or any sport has this problem is I'll give you an example. I just think certain fighters, I bias certain fighters. I get emotionally attached to certain fighters. That's a big no-no, right? In betting and winning money.
Yeah.
That's a big
I
no-no, right?
honestly, I don't have that. I
You
am
don't have
quite
that.
lucky. I don't have it. I did when I first started watching the sport. I was a huge fan of certain fighters in the first 3 or 4 years when I started watching it. But over time, that just kind of went away. And I don't know why. I think it's just like any job. The more you do it, if you start to do a job you love, initially you love it and everything's amazing about it. But then the longer you do it, the novelty kind of wears off. And I think that was the same with fighting. I used to get like butterflies before big events. Like I'd be so excited for them. The night before Anderson Silva would fight, I would just be so excited. Wouldn't even be able to sleep. But now I'd never really get that. It's kind of like burnt out. So
Yeah, I think
yeah,
that's developed over time, right? That's from your
yeah.
experience. I don't know if I'm a person who can ever get rid of that, because I've watched MMA for so long, and I'm going to give you some specific examples of where it screwed me up. Even with you in my ear during live betting, I just I have my own opinions sometimes. Like here's an example: when Max Holloway fought Dustin Poirier, right? And Max came into the fight a pretty sizable favorite, right? Dustin was like a plus 200 something, 250. And so after the first round, Max got messed up. Like Dustin won the round. He won the second round too. But after the first round, I was like, there's no way Max is going to lose this fight. Just in my head, I was like, there's no way he's going to come back and he's going to dig it out. And what his odds in live betting was like plus 200 or something. It was like something pretty, it was pretty good. So I was like, you know what, I'm putting down a bet. He's not saying, Chris isn't saying anything in my ear, but I'm putting down a bet because I know this guy's going to dig it out. And he almost digged it out, but in the end he lost. And you ended up uh, calling out a live bet sometime in like the third or fourth round, I think. I think it was the fourth round. And me being an emotional fight fan, I'm like, I have a bet on Max. Why would I put a bet on Dustin and hedge myself out of this easy victory in my head? And of course, what happens? Dustin wins an easy decision. And in hindsight, I look back, I'm like, why don't I just listen to the person I'm paying money uh, to tell me how to do it? And that I think is something that comes from, like, you do this for a living, and I train athletes, and I run gyms for a living. Like, stay in your lane, I guess is the lesson there. So I'm not going to make that mistake again.
I think a big part of it though is it's kind of like I it's I'm very conscious that other people are betting their hard-earned money based on what I'm telling them. So it's a lot of pressure. Like every time I go to recommend a bet, I really have to be absolutely sure because I couldn't live with myself if I thought that I was causing people to lose. Obviously, we always take losses, but I need to be sure that if we do lose, I have absolute conviction in that decision and it was the right decision. Otherwise, it's negligent. Do you see what I mean? So when I do recommend a bet, I am really, 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 really sure that whether that bet wins or loses, it was the right decision at that time. And that's why I like to do the YouTube videos and I love to have the website because it keeps me in check as well. It's easy to not really put that much thought or consideration into a bet when it's only going to affect you. But when potentially you could cause, hundreds or even thousands now with the YouTube videos, thousands of people to lose money, that just would not make me feel good at all. So every time I recommend a bet, I make sure that it is rock solid. So that helps. It really does help putting content out and sharing my betting information with other people. Benefits me as well because it wouldn't be so easy to always be on it and always make the right decisions and always be focused if it was just me. Because it's much easier to it's not like self-destructive behavior, but it's much easier to make a bad decision if it only affects you rather than someone else. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. I think you have a responsibility, and I think, and you are putting that responsibility on yourself, and that's something that, I don't want to sound like, I'm kissing your ass here, but when I heard you talk, and when I see the way that you do things, I can kind of tell that you have integrity. Like you're a man of integrity, you have good character, and that's why we're doing this. I've
Thanks a
heard,
lot.
thank you for doing what you do. I have had experience in I guess other MMA betting sites, and I've heard other podcasts, and just the way sometimes people talk, I can tell that they are low integrity, and you
Hmm.
always explain things in the way that I think is the right way to do it. You never guarantee anything. You say, look, I have a lot of confidence in this bet, but of course, any given day we could lose, right? But we put this bet down because with our research, with your research, with the research that you've done, you've come to that best decision, and you come to that decision by watching fights, right? So I wanted to get to, how do you research the fights? Like, what is your process? And I don't want you to give away like everything. Just kind of give us an
Yeah.
idea of, let's say, the Bellator fight that's coming up, right? You've researched
Mhm.
probably most of the main card. So how do you do this? What is your process?
So the first thing I'll do, obviously, I'm conscious of the fact that odds can always change. So I will always start and prioritize the fights where I think there may be the best betting opportunities. So I'll scan through all the fights taking place, and any fighters that I think may be potentially good bets, I will prioritize researching those first. So what I would do, I would bring up the records of the two guys that are fighting, and I'll watch like the last 2 to 4 fights from both guys. I don't like to go any further back than 2 to 4 fights. In fact, it's not 2 to 4 fights. It's really all their fights over the last 2 or 3 years, which is usually 2 to 4 fights for most guys. Don't like to go any further back than 2 to 3 years because fighters improve at such a rapid rate that if you go any further back than 2 or 3 years, you're going to be evaluating a fighter based on a level of skill that just is not accurate anymore. It's working without update information. So it's really important to work with the latest fights. And then I will kind of just visualize how both guys may match up, look at how different fighters react to different circumstances. If I spot that one guy has got a weakness to one particular thing, I'll go back through his record and see if he's faced opponents which could cause him problems in that area. So if we look at the fight with a really simple example, familiar example for tonight would be Lyoto Machida against Chael Sonnen, two fighters everyone's familiar with. This is a really basic example, but obviously Chael Sonnen's only path to victory is to get Lyoto Machida to the ground and grind him out. So if you look at Machida's record over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, hasn't really fought any wrestlers. So in order to determine how he may deal with the threat that Sonnen brings to the table, you have to go further back in his career to maybe the time he fought Phil Davis or Eric Anders or that kind of thing, and cherry pick the fights that you watch from him. But then it's very complex because at the same time you then have to take into consideration the fact that he's 40 years old. This is probably going to be, he's probably not going to be fighting for too much longer. So is the skills that he demonstrated 3 or 4 years ago still relevant? Is he still able to defend takedowns or work his way back to his feet like he could in the past? So it's all this information to take into consideration. So I will form an opinion, a first opinion based on the footage that I watch. And then say, for example, I identify a bet. Say, I think Lyoto Machida is a good bet. What I will then do is I will go to a deeper level and I will check his social media profiles to see if there are any clues to who he's been training with, where he's been training, what his diet might be like, that kind of thing. Then I will basically do a Google search, see if there are any articles linking him to being injured. I will see how much time he had to prepare for the fight. I will also go into things, for example, you can look at how he lost his last fight. Did he sustain any injuries? What was the nature of the loss? Because we know certain types of losses affect fighters, in the future more than others. So, for example, bad knockout losses quite often affect the fighter very badly, and it can take them a fight or two to get back on track and go back to how they were to perform before the knockout loss. Sometimes they never recover. And then what I will do, if there are no red flags within the extra level of information I go into, I will try and assign a probability to what probability I give Machida of winning. I will then look at the odds to determine if there's value in betting him. What I will also do then, before actually making my decision, I will go and try and find any recent interviews they've done to try and find out like what mind state they're in. If there are any red flags in anything that they say in interviews. I mean, I love to. It's kind of like it's kind of like a race against time, because ideally, fight day would be the optimum time to lock in bets, because by fight day you've studied the fight footage, you've learned about any injuries they're facing, you've checked their social media profiles, you've had a chance to listen to them talk in fight week interviews, and you've seen the early weigh-ins and the ceremonial weigh-ins. So you have so much data available to make a really good decision. But the problem is it's a race against time. So if we look at like the Eduardo Dantas bet, he was around about plus 180 at the beginning of the week. And I knew that if I waited until the fight week interviews and the weigh-ins to come out, those odds would have got destroyed.
And
so
they did.
It's like walking a fine line between how much information are you willing to place a bet on. And the way that I come to this decision in my own head is the more information you have available to you, the more confident you can feel in the probability you're giving a fighter of winning. All that less information does is really make it less sure that you're being correct with the probability that you're assigning a fighter of winning. But if you give a fighter, if you give a fighter a probability of winning, and there's a big difference between that probability and the implied probability of the odds, I'm more willing to take that gamble without the additional information, because I know that there's a big enough margin there that if I do get it wrong, that's okay. Because if I consistently over time get my money in strong positions, which is super strong like that, you will make money, irrespective of the fact that you may miss out on a few nuggets of information. So, for example, I don't think it's going to affect the fight at all, but Juan Archuleta tonight is being cornered by TJ Dillashaw. That was a new piece of information that came out in the Fight Week interviews yesterday. I didn't have that when I made my bet. I don't think it's going to be that much of an issue. But it's just additional information that crops up we didn't have to work with. So that's why I always preach, you have to get your money into strong positions, not marginal positions. Because when you cap a fighter as having a certain probability of winning, there is no way to know whether that probability is accurate, because there could be information present that you are not aware of. You know, for all we know, Eduardo Dantas could be going into the fight tonight with a broken hand, or Lyoto Machida might have a staph infection, or who knows? So you can't assign probabilities to that. But by consistently getting in your money in a strong position, having a huge margin over the odds, it doesn't matter, because when these things do crop up, you're still winning way more than you're losing over the long term.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. So I mean, you're doing a lot of research then. You're not just watching fights, you're looking at social media profiles, you're looking at articles, you're looking at mindset psychology. I didn't really think about that, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure, like, obviously it plays a huge part in the fight, right? I mean, it's huge. It's not just previous performance that somebody could, like, here's an example too. Oh, by the way, I want to go through that whole example you just made with Lyoto and Chael. So just for everybody listening, right now is Friday, the June the 14th, and Lyoto Machida is fighting Chael Sonnen tonight. Lyoto Machida is about a minus 390 odds, and Chael Sonnen is plus 330. So you've watched tape on both fighters, and
Mm-hmm.
you decided to make a bet on either of these guys based on those odds, and if so, why? And if not, why?
So I haven't bet on this fight. I would love to, because I think Machida is going to win quite easily. But the problem is, if you look at his current odds, so is he currently around about minus 400,
400, yeah, 400 on
somewhere around
average.
there?
Yeah.
So off the top of my head, I'm not sure of the exact implied probability, but I'm pretty sure minus 400 is about 80%. So the bookies believe Lyoto Machida is going to win around 80% of the time. And in order to be able to get any value in betting him, you'd have to give him an 85 to 90% chance of winning, which for me is just impossible. No matter how much you like Machida, no matter how much you think he can win. We haven't seen him fight any wrestlers over the last couple of years. He's 40 years old. You don't know what his motivation's like. You don't know if he's going to be dealing with some long-term injuries.
You could
It's just too many risk factors.
slip on a banana peel. I mean,
Exactly.
you can't. I don't think you could give. Yeah, there's no way. 90% chance to beat Chael. I would give him 70% chance at best. So
I
yeah,
agree.
so you would not bet this because you say this a lot, is let the odds do the work for you, right? So the odds
Hmm.
here are just too, they're just not, it's just not a good position to be in, right? You don't want to
Hmm.
put your money in on Machida. You'd have to risk a whole lot of money to make a very small amount of money. And if you continuously make bets like this, if you lose one out of four,
Hmm.
you're only at break even. So I
Hmm.
totally get it. Yeah, that's great, man. So that's a great example. I think that was excellent. Just for me, I agree with everything. I look at the fight against Chael, and I'm like, Machida's going to run through him in a couple rounds. He's going to KO
Hmm.
him, and that's probably going to happen. But
Yeah.
we cannot take that risk because of the risk that we would be putting in to to
Hmm.
to to bet on this fight. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you know what we were talking about earlier on, where we were saying a high level gambler would outperform an MMA expert.
Yes.
That's another one of the reasons why, because someone that knows a lot about MMA would just research that fight, think Lyoto Machida's going to absolutely destroy Chael Sonnen tonight, and they would keep making those bets. And what they don't realize is over time, mathematically, it was more probable that they would lose because of the unpredictable things happening. That even though they know a lot about MMA, they might not understand. They might not have that experience of knowing literally anything can happen. And that's really another great example.
Yeah, so that was a great example. What about the main event tonight? What about Nieman Gracie and Rory Macdonald? So I know quite a bit about both of these guys because they both kind of train with a pretty famous team, Renzo Gracie. Um, Rory is TriStar, but they're kind of affiliated, and so in my head, I'm like, and I, you give your breakdown definitely. In my head, I'm thinking, Rory has these mental issues. He looked horrible against Fitch, even though Fitch might have been juiced up. Neiman Gracie is somebody who is, I hold very highly, as a jiu-jitsu guy
Mm-hmm.
and as a mixed martial artist. I see Neiman Gracie as a underdog here as a good bet. What do you think about that fight since you've researched it and I haven't?
So Rory McDonald was a super, super, super difficult pass for me. I just want to bet Rory McDonald so bad tonight, but I'm very concerned over the way
Oh,
that,
you wanted to
like you
bet
said, he
Rory.
was tough. Yeah, and I really do want to bet Rory. I think that the way I'd approach this fight from a betting perspective is this is another one of those fights that I would call like a checkmate matchup,
Hmm.
because researching Gracie this week doesn't have the best offensive wrestling. We know Rory McDonald's got legendary takedown defense, and the difference between John Fitch's style and Gracie's style was Fitch was able to get in very deep on his hips, wet blanket him, make him work very hard to defend takedowns, was able to chain into all different kinds of takedown attempts, which meant that over time he wore Rory McDonald down, which opened up takedown opportunities for him. With Naaman Gracie, because he doesn't have that, traditional wrestling background, he's more of a single shot grappler where he will shoot a takedown, and if he doesn't secure that takedown, he'll retreat. And as we know, Rory McDonald's initial takedown defense is absolutely spectacular. So I worry that I don't see Gracie being able to get this fight to the ground. And I noticed a few things that he did standing, where he would kind of like turn his head away from his opponent, and he would just look very uncomfortable in exchanges and stand quite flat-footed and rigid, which leaves him wide open to Rory's jab. So I think it's a terrible matchup stylistically for Gracie. I do see Rory dominating, but the problem is Gracie is a young, hungry, intelligent, athletic, brilliant fighter with a super high level ground game, who is motivated and hungry to build a huge career and name for himself. Whereas Rory McDonald, like he said openly in his fight after the John Fitch fight, that he wasn't motivated to fight anymore. He struggled with the mental aspect of hurting people. And when I went back and watched this fight against John Fitch, there were two things that really concerned me about that performance. The first thing was when he was on the bottom against Fitch, he just accepted being on the bottom, didn't really work that hard to try and get back to his feet, which is very strange for Rory because we know his ability to work his way back to his feet is excellent, particularly when against the cage. He was in a strong position to wall walk and work his way back up to his feet throughout the entire Fitch fight because all the takedowns came against the cage, but he just chose to be on the bottom instead, which in my mind is a fighter psychologically accepting a loss because he is allowing himself to be controlled in a losing position because, like I say, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to win the fight off your back. And another thing that really concerned me was we know Rory McDonald's got an amazing jab, but for long periods of the John Fitch fight, he was able to pressure Fitch and put Fitch's back right against the cage where Fitch had nowhere to move. He was like a rabbit caught in the headlights. He looked very nervous, very insecure. And Rory could have absolutely teed off on him and got the KO win. But instead, Rory stood right in boxing range, flat-footed, and just didn't let his hands go. And we see this in a lot of boxers when they start to go on the decline. They they have the footwork, they have the head movement, they have the technique to get into the right positions. But when it comes to pulling the trigger, they can't do it. I mean, perhaps the best example I can think of in recent years in MMA would be Anderson Silva, where he still looks fast and explosive and technical. But in so many of his fights over the last few years, particularly the Michael Bisping fight, the Derek Brunson fight, even the Adesanya fight to some degree, gets into these positions and just cannot mentally pull the trigger. And I kind of saw that in Macdonald's performance against Fitch. So it's very difficult from a betting perspective because stylistically, it is the worst stylistic matchup imaginable for Nieman Gracie. But he is going to have the hunger and desire to go out there and win and find a way to win. Whereas Macdonald's got all the skills, but is he going to be able to pull the trigger? Is he still motivated? It's a complex fight.
Right.
I want to bet Macdonald because you see two guys. You see one guy's having a huge advantage, but you just know that you can't trust him.
Well,
and this is the difference, though. So this is an important difference where we talk about consistently putting our money in strong positions. So I think Rory Macdonald will absolutely dominate Nieman Gracie. But there are X factors at play where we can't trust him to show up and perform to his full potential. I feel exactly the same about Eduardo Dantas. If Eduardo Dantas shows up and performs to his full potential, he will absolutely dominate. But he's very inconsistent. Quite often he doesn't show up and perform to his full potential. I feel equally confident in both guys. The difference is the odds on Rory Macdonald, he's a big favourite. Eduardo Dantas is a big underdog.
Right.
I don't mind taking on a lot of risk with Dantas because the payoff is much better. If Rory Macdonald's odds were the same as Eduardo Dantas's, I would bet Rory Macdonald in a heartbeat without even thinking about it. So I think that's another aspect of gambling, not focusing on the fight and the fighters, focusing on how a fighter could lose and if you're willing to take on that risk.
Right. So you've convinced me because this is again why you are the professional and I am an emotional fan at best. So I just looked at Rory McDonald's record and he's never been submitted. That's I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean everything, but I mean he's faced people like Damian Maia, so you don't necessarily get all the information just by doing that. You have to watch the fights, obviously, but you've based on I listened really carefully to everything you said, and then I was looking at kind of the playing this out in my head and just thinking, how is Nieman gonna win? Like he'd have to submit Rory, a guy who has never been submitted before, and also this is actually something I just noticed. Rory is younger than Nieman by a year.
That's insane. Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah, Nieman is 30. Nieman's 30 years old and Rory's 29. So I mean, I'm a strength conditioning coach. I'm a trainer. I kind of know what this could be, this psychological problem that Rory is going through. He's taken a lot of head trauma. Okay, so that's bad in itself, right? But he's not quite at the age where your testosterone goes down, but there has been links to CTE or your head trauma and lowered testosterone. So that could be what's happening to him. In at least just my just analysis of it. He could be just, getting older, his testosterone's going down. He doesn't have the desire to actually fight anymore. I mean, I'm getting this myself. I'm 34. I used to be very, very aggressive in the gym. I used to always want to spar jiu-jitsu. And then, nowadays I kind of just want to teach my class and just roll light and just kind of have fun. And there's really no competitive drive. I really have no competitive drive in me as far as fighting goes anymore. I used to do amateur MMA and I was very aggressive. So I get it. And if that is the case, that's a big problem, and he's young. So if he does lose this fight, I think it's over for him, to be honest.
Yeah,
once you get that feeling, you don't come back. But yeah, that was a brilliant, analysis of why you would bet Rory. And you know what? I agree. I was originally thinking, yeah.
It might just be, I like to, it's kind of like another expression where the trend is your friend, where you don't want to make an assumption and assume that a trend is in play. when there may have just been an anomaly present. So, for example, everyone is assuming that Rory Macdonald has lost the motivation to fight, whereas 18 months ago he beat Douglas Lima. Do you see what I'm saying? So, is it just one bad night, one bad training camp? Maybe he had an argument with his wife before the fight and she asked him not to fight anymore. Maybe a business investment went
Could be
wrong.
a
Maybe he
fluke.
fell out with someone, a coach, and he just said something crazy, in the heat of the moment. So I completely agree with what you said. If Rory shows up tonight without that drive and desire to fight, we can then assume that a trend has been established, that Rory Macdonald is definitely on a downward trajectory. But I just think it's dangerous to assume that after one strange performance. It was a strange performance against Fitch. I'm not going to say it was a bad performance. It was a strange performance. And then something he said on the mic. I like just to get confirmation that a fighter is going one way or the other. And that's one mistake that I've made over the years. And this is something I've tightened up on myself. So I've been quick to assume a fighter is moving one way or the other, or I've been slow to react. Whereas now I've learned just to kind of let a trend establish itself so we can be absolutely sure. Because a lot of the time, the bookies and the casual betting public, they don't really put as much thought into these trend reversals as guys like us who look really deep into things. So chances are we can still profit from this situation,
Yeah, that was the next thing I
further down the
wanted to.
line.
Yeah, that was the next thing, the changes in the fighter. So that was the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, and this is a big topic. This is something that really interests me a lot, and I've never really heard it talked about at length and talked about by somebody who has probably watched as many fights as you have. So USADA came into the UFC December 2015. And from what I know of what you've told me, when USADA came into the UFC December 2015, you went on a massive losing streak, and this tells me a couple things. This tells me that USADA had a big impact on the UFC. Um, Obviously, there we can jump to conclusions and assume fighters are using PEDs and they stopped using PEDs. Um, could it be for any other reason, or what do you think?
I think it was like a culmination of things. It could be PEDs, but as well we know things like HGH and stuff would help fighters recover from injuries. So, for example, I think maybe before USADA, if a fighter was to pick up an injury in training camp, there may have been supplements or HGH or something they could use to heal that injury. So
Out
they're
of
going into
camp.
fight night. Yeah, out of camp, so that when they actually go into the fight, then they're not competing with injuries or the injuries aren't as severe. Whereas post USADA, obviously everyone's got bills to pay. UFC fighters don't get paid very much. So if they haven't fought in a year and they haven't made any money, they need a paycheck. So whereas in the past they might have been able to take PEDs or supplements or HGH or something to help them recover from injuries, now that they can't post USADA, we could be seeing guys fight with injuries way more often than
Right.
before. So out of character bad performances, inconsistent performances are way more common. Way more common.
Right. And Chris, real quick,
That
I just wanted to quickly tell the people listening what USADA is, and there might not everybody
mhm,
might know what it is. USADA is basically the U.S. anti-doping agency, and it's like an outside body that tests fighters, um, not just during events when they're fighting, but also like in their normal daily lives. So they could show up at your house at any time. When I was working with fighters, they would just show up at 6 a.m. sometimes. Um, so so that was actually a really good point there that either you said or I said that I think people haven't thought about is using PEDs outside of an actual fight, like during before your camp starts, right? Because before USADA came, my understanding was that the UFC only tested for PED usage around the time of a fight, right? They didn't go to your house
no.
randomly, and so that's huge. I mean, like here's an
mhm,
example. I fight if I fight in the UFC, I can just cycle off. when it's time to fight. I would have extreme advantages over my opponent who did not even use PEDs. I could have trained more during my camp. I could have done so much more. And if their testing wasn't strict, I could use a fake dick. I could, there's so many things that you could
Hmm.
do to like cheat the test, and
Hmm.
and just to give everybody full disclosure, I once had elbow surgery and was on TRT for 3 months. I was the strongest guy in the gym for 3 months, and I kid you not, some of those benefits lasted beyond those 3 months. Like to this day, I've been able to, do certain things in the gym without any training that I wasn't able to
That's
before.
crazy.
It's
That
like
is
I
crazy.
it's like I gained, you know, I kind of understand the physiology, the satellite cells and whatnot. It's a long discussion, but yeah, so that's huge. I mean, um, so anyway, there's a couple examples that I wanted you to give if you're willing to, and
Hmm.
I don't want to bash any fighters, but I also want to give transparency. So
Hmm.
are there any examples of fighters that looked drastically different? And we're not saying they used PEDs. We're just saying after USADA came, something happened and they looked different. Are you willing to share some of these examples?
Hmm. So I'm not I'm not the best at identifying physical changes, but because I watch so many fights, I can spot very different performances from fighters. So it's styles of performances, the way they look, the way they move, their speed, their aggression. And the biggest and best example I can think, you can literally kind of categorize a guy's career in half, would be Johnny Hendricks. He was the best example I can
That's a
think
great
of.
example.
But because pre-USADA, he outboxed Robbie Lawler twice. I know he lost a split decision one time. It was one of the worst decisions I've ever seen. So he outboxed Robbie Lawler. He was knocking guys 8 to 12 feet across the octagon, knocked them out dead. He completely destroyed GSP in every single aspect of the fight, grappling, striking, you name it. He outstruck Carlos Condit. And then overnight, there was just nothing there. The best example, if you want to see the impact that USADA had on the sport, I'm going to mention Kelvin Gastelum now, which is a tricky example because a lot of people have this kind of perception that Gastelum's a strong wrestler, but he really isn't, and he especially wasn't back then. If you go and watch Kelvin Gastelum's fight against Neil Magny, I believe it was like November 2015, you will understand what I'm about to say way better. Because Kelvin Gastelum has always been a fighter with bad takedown defense, quite a low level ground game. And somehow he was able to turn Johnny Hendricks, a guy that had outgrappled GSP, outgrappled Robbie Lawler, NCAA Division One wrestler. He was able to shut down every single one of Johnny Hendricks' takedown attempts and turn him into a panic wrestler. It was just unbelievable. It was the most unbelievable thing I'd ever seen. And if you look at the career trajectory that Johnny Hendricks has been on, he went from beating some of the best fighters in the world pre 2016 to post 2016, only winning maybe one fight in seven. And most recently, he was knocked out in bare knuckle fighting championship by Dakota Cochran, a guy that never made it in the UFC. He was actually eliminated in the first round of the Ultimate Fighter, a guy that was basically a journeyman in legacy fighting championships his whole career. So you go from beating some of the best fighters in the world, Robbie Lawler and GSP, to getting knocked out dead on a bare knuckle fighting show by a guy that would never even make it in even on the prelims of a UFC card, never even made it on TUF.
I think that
So
guy
you go
did.
from being
I think that guy did gay porn too. I think that's the same
exactly,
guy.
it's crazy.
Irrelevant.
You go from being one of the best fighters in the world within 3 years to getting knocked out by a guy that is just nowhere near UFC level, which is insane. And there are loads of examples like that, but he's the clearest one. But to appreciate how big a decline that is, you have to watch Hendricks' fights against Lawler and GSP and watch Gastelum's fight against Magny. So I think he fought Magny 6 or 7 months before he fought Hendricks.
Hmm.
And that will just show you how bad Gastelum's takedown defense is, what in theory an NCAA Division One level wrestler like Hendricks should have been able to do to him, and how crazy it was to see Gastelum completely shut him down.
So Johnny Hendricks is no longer fighting, right? So at least in the UFC or MMA. So what we're saying to people listening is, Chris has used an example of Kelvin Gastelum as a way to shed light onto Johnny's decline, right? So this isn't about Kelvin. This is about Johnny. It's you using separate fights to see how much of a change Johnny Hendricks
Hmm.
had. And I'm just looking at Johnny Hendricks' record, and it is as soon as it looks like he beat Matt Brown and then went on one of the craziest losing streaks in the UFC. Yeah, so it just seems like as soon as he beat Matt Brown by decision, he just tanked. It just
Hmm.
somehow he beat Hector Lombard. But
Hmm.
then that could also be another guy that was affected by USADA. He doesn't pass the eye
Yeah.
test, that's for sure. Do you?
With
Yeah.
with USADA as well, I think it's different kind of reasons why fighters may have gone on a decline. So if we look back at Johnny Hendricks' career, he always used to struggle with the weight cuts. He always used to complain about the weight cuts. So then post USADA, if it's more difficult to use like diuretics or IVs, it might not be that he was taking performance enhancing drugs, but it might have been that his body was so depleted from the weight cutting that he couldn't perform at his best anymore because he couldn't obviously rehydrate correctly.
Right. So it could be.
There's so many reasons.
It could also be that they banned IVs. So instead of,
Hmm.
maybe Johnny wasn't taking PEDs, but he was relying on IV to rehydrate, and all of a sudden he can't use IVs. Now he's left to his own rehydration devices, and he's not able to properly. That could be it
Hmm.
too. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's possible. I'd like to think that not a lot of fighters used PEDs, but that's ignorant. That's the highest level. Um, I would say more fighters are using than not using, even with USADA, to be honest. So that's a great example, Johnny Hendricks. Do you have any examples of current fighters?
Yeah, Kat Zingano is probably again the best one that I can think of.
Ooh,
If you look at Kat Zingano pre-USADA, um, so again, it's difficult because I'm going to use Juliana Pena here as a measuring stick. So people have a perception that Juliana Pena is a strong wrestler, but she's not. She's actually got quite poor offensive wrestling. And if we look at how strong a wrestler Kat Zingano is, how strong a grappler, if you go back and watch any of Kat Zingano's fights pre-USADA, there are three things you'll see. Her offensive wrestling is incredible, her cardio is incredible, and she can fight at a very high pace. And then if you watch her fight against Juliana Pena, in the first round against Pena, she absolutely ragdolled Pena. She used her as like a human basketball. It was almost like a grown woman fighting a child. She threw Pena all around the octagon in the first round. Trademark Kat Zingano does it exactly as expected. And then in the second and third round, just looked flat footed, no cardio, accepted being on the bottom, no urgency to work your way out of bad positions. And it was literally, again, exactly like Hendricks, you could draw a line right through their career. Pre-USADA, completely different to post-USADA. And now if we look at Zingano, she's flat-footed. She makes questionable decisions in fights. She gives up position a lot. She doesn't have that offensive wrestling drive that she did before USADA. There are just so many examples. So she's another good one. Anthony Pettis is another great one. This is a guy that went from running up the side of octagons and, throwing up all kinds of crazy submissions off his back and cartwheel kicks and explosive knockout finishes.
he
If you look
looks
at
very
Anthony
different.
Pettis, see, now I don't notice that kind of thing. You would notice that with what you do for a living. You're an expert in that area. I just see skills, the way they perform. And if you look at Pettis' record pre and post USADA, pre USADA, tons of knockout wins. Post USADA, no knockout wins.
Right.
Prior to his knockout over Stephen Thompson, which was a bit of not going to say a fluke, but it was definitely a kind of a flash KO. If you look at the number of KOs Pettis had before USADA compared to after USADA, I think since USADA he's got like one KO in like 7 or 8 fights. And
Yeah, but
it's
that
just,
what you said was really important there was he would throw these incredibly athletic moves at people. And
Mhm,
you're right. I mean, this might have to do with age too, but it's just I have not he's very flat-footed. Exactly. He doesn't
mhm.
he seems much less athletic. That's for sure.
Yeah. A really good example, if people want to drill down and look at the change in Pettis, I would say look at his performances against RDA. He got absolutely destroyed against RDA, but very explosive, very sharp, very fast, loads of heart. Look at his performance against, Gilbert Melendez. Look at his performance against, I mean, anyone pre-USADA. And then I think the first time that he fought post-USADA, and I was like, what the hell is going on here, guys, was when he fought Eddie Alvarez.
Yes.
And I literally could not believe what I was watching. Eddie Alvarez, again, people think he's a strong wrestler. He hasn't got very good offensive wrestling. Conor showed that when he fought Eddie. We know Conor's got bad takedown defense, and literally he shut Eddie down in that fight. Eddie didn't get anywhere near a takedown. Eddie doesn't have good offensive wrestling. He's primarily a boxer. And he was just able to completely manhandle Pettis in the clinch and take him down. And in the past, you'd see Pettis exploding out of these kind of positions, punishing guys in these positions with, again, explosive submissions off his back and fighting out of the clinch with elbows and all kinds of crazy techniques. Whereas in the Alvarez fight, he just accepted being on the bottom, accepted having his back controlled against the cage in the clinch. And it was just completely different. It was just so different. So those are like some of the best
Yeah,
high-profile
those are
examples
great
I can think
examples.
of.
I mean, we have an example of basically everything, right? We have a guy who, I mean, Johnny Hendricks too. The eye test is telling me he went from a pretty lean and ripped guy who looked like he could punch holes through people to, like just like you said, getting knocked out by a guy bare knuckle boxing. It's very strange. But anyway, we're not saying people are on PEDs. We're just looking at facts. We're just looking at
Hmm.
fights and the results of the fight and how people look. Now,
Hmm.
on the other side of that coin, are there fighters that after USADA they they got better? Is there or maybe everybody else got worse and they stayed the same? Do you have any examples of those types of fighters?
Yeah, I guess these kind of examples are hard to come by, but Bisping's obviously the most high profile example we can think of. Because if you would have thought, even if you just look at the two Luke Rockhold fights, Luke Rockhold, I don't know, you might have way more knowledge on what this could be, but before you saw that Rockhold was a tough, athletic, he's just a tough, athletic, well-rounded guy, but he's looked so fragile since USADA came into play. And if you look at the two difference in performances, he's fought Bisping twice. He fought him in Australia, dominated Bisping. And then in the second Bisping fight, looked really nervous and fragile. So it's just it's just crazy. I don't know what that could be. Luke
Yeah.
Rockhold may be another example, but guys that have come on and done better. You look at Cowboy is actually probably another good example of that. Cerrone's looked a hell of a
Yeah,
lot better
he
post
probably doesn't
USADA.
take he probably doesn't take PEDs. If he's
Hmm.
drinking beer the day before the weigh-in, I
Yeah.
don't think a guy like that's taking PEDs. Luke Rockhold's a weird example because he's a guy who I don't think his body has changed at all. That's a
Hmm.
weird that guy when he was at his in his prime, when he was champion, he looked the same. When he
Hmm.
was getting KO'd by Bisping, he looked the same. KO'd by Yoel, looked the same. So he's I don't know. Maybe there's something else there, but yeah, I can see what you're talking about. Yeah,
You know
Bisping's a
what?
great example.
I think I do have another good example. Stipe Miocic might be another good one because before USADA, he was undefeated, but he was kind of just one of those guys that's good at everything but great at nothing. And then since a post USADA era, where attributes like cardio and heart and toughness are so much more important. Miocic has always had an amazing gas tank. He's always been able to fight at a high pace for a long period of time. And when USADA came into effect, he has just thrived since then.
Right.
With the
Yes.
performances that he's been able to put in. Whereas you think pre-USADA, he'd probably be struggling against guys like Overeem and Vadum, who had so much better technique than him, but they also had the gas tank to fight at a high pace for just as long as he did. In a post-USADA era, they may cause him big problems in the first round, but if they're racing in a marathon, there's only going to be one winner. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems these are like almost like you don't really necessarily have to look at them. You just kind of see how they perform, and they're. I
Hmm.
guess here's another thing is there are people out there in the strength conditioning world and in the just the fitness world that do think that steroids and PEDs don't do that much. And I've seen the research and I don't know. I'm kind of on both sides. I think they do a lot, but I also think a lot of what they do is psychological. So maybe just
Yeah.
not taking something is, that was a piece of who they were as a fighter, and then they're going into a fight kind of handicapped, hamstrung, so their psychology is different. So that might be an
Hmm.
even bigger factor is just not is knowing you don't have that extra juice as opposed
Hmm.
to the juice actually doing anything. So these are all great examples, and I wanted to move on and talk about uh, this is something where I just don't know enough about, but I can see it happening. Is you watch a lot of fights, obviously, and you say that there's a lot of fixed fights. I can see the obvious fixed fights, like Mark Coleman getting toe holded. There was like that's the like some Japanese fights, some pride fights. There's some weird stuff in Bellator. Chael has had fights where it looks like he's just giving up position for no reason. How how many fights do you think are fixed? Why do you think they're fixed? And which organizations do you think fixes the most fights?
I think that it's hard to say how many are fixed, but I think ever since time began, wherever there's money, there's corruption. And if we look at, sports that have had issues with match fixing in the past, much sports which would be much more difficult to manipulate than an MMA fight where only two people are involved. You look at the NBA have had their issues,
Yep.
Italian football, Spanish football. So if you can manipulate the highest level of these sports, you can definitely, manipulate MMA. And I think a big problem with MMA is whenever people are not paid that well, there is an incentive for them to find ways to earn extra money. If we look at the Bellator card tonight, some of the guys on the Bellator main card, if they lose, they'll only be pulling in $5,000 as a purse. When, you could just bet on yourself. You could take a fall and bet, 20, 30, 40, 50 grand on yourself and take a fall. If you look
Hmm.
at a guy that's fighting Dylan Dennis tonight, Humphrey, right?
Hmm.
Humphrey,
Max
Max
Humphrey.
Humphrey. I'm not obviously not accusing Humphrey, but he's probably going to make $5,000-$10,000 max.
Right.
Way
Right.
less than minimum wage if he fights over, once
Right.
a year. His odds are astronomical. He's like a 10.0 plus 900 underdog.
Yeah.
If he just
Yeah.
bet 10, 20 grand on himself, he'll earn more from throwing that fight than he would in 2, 3 years fighting in Bellator. So I think whenever you are not paying people fairly, you leave yourself open to corruption. And I think I see it because I watch so many fights that I can research a fight and I will pretty much be able to I will pretty much know what to expect from a fighter, how I expect them to perform. And sometimes they just look completely different. And sometimes you think, that could be injuries, obviously, the mental aspect of the game. But I don't think not always. I think that whenever you're paying people, $10,000, $20,000 to fight, and they could maybe make a few $100,000 betting through corruption, definitely think fight fixing's an issue, one hundred
Wow,
percent.
I didn't really, I never thought about it that way. I was more, I always thought maybe the bookies would approach these low level fighters and try to
Mm-hmm.
influence them. But yeah, you know what? You could just pretty much bet on yourself if you wanted to throw the fight, right? So yeah,
And
that's
also
good.
think about it. Like Max Humphrey's probably not the best example because he hasn't maybe earned that much throughout his career to be able to do that. But if you look at a fighter like say Ricardo Lamas, again, I'm not accusing anyone. They're just good examples because of the current situation they're in their career. So he's picked up a few wins lately. So he's at no risk of being cut if he loses one fight. He's 37 years old. He must know in his heart there is no way that he is ever going to become a UFC champion, ever. It's not happening. He's an intelligent guy. He's got to be realistic. If he were to lose a fight in the UFC, it would not affect his career at all. It really wouldn't. He's at the tail end of his career. He's not working towards a title shot. If he takes a loss, no one will care, really. He's not going to get released from the UFC. He's still going to be able to keep fighting. So I think whenever you've got situations like that where the reward of winning doesn't outweigh the reward of doing something corrupt. There's always a chance for corruption. And that goes for any aspect of life. You know, when you're paying guys $5,000-$10,000, I don't think corruption's an issue where you've got these young, hungry, up-and-coming guys that want to be world champions and they're motivated to learn and get better every day. When fighters get to the tail end of their career, they've done it all, they've seen it all, and all they care about is creating a bright future for their family and securing their financial future. Like, it's
Yeah,
logical that
yeah,
they would consider it, you know?
yeah, yeah. You almost can't even blame them for making the smarter
Yeah,
choice. There's
you
more
you
your
can't blame them,
livelihood.
but yeah, because they're not paid fairly, so I couldn't blame them. You know,
Right,
they're putting
right.
their bodies on the line. But again, I do also think that I do strongly believe that there's no smoke without fire. And of course, a few years ago, Tai Hyung Bang was
Oh
imprisoned
yeah.
for alleged match fixing or fight fixing. I think he was in, was it a Japanese card, I
Korean,
think?
I think he's a Korean
Korean card.
fighter. I
Hmm.
don't know. I'm not sure, but I do remember that name. And yes, he was supposed. But the weirdest thing about that example was he won the fight he was supposed to lose, and somehow.
Yeah.
But yeah, he then admitted to taking money from I think gangsters or something to throw the
Hmm.
fight. And yeah, there you go. If you need a concrete example, there it is. Can you are there any fights like recent fights or just fights in a big organization like the
Hmm.
UFC or pretty much the UFC that you can think of that were like if I was gonna say it was a fixed fight, I would point to that one. Are there any that stuck out to you?
Like, not so much in the UFC. I don't really spot too many. And you know what? This is what actually makes me think that fight fixing is a really big deal, because when it happens, it's so glaringly obvious that it's almost like like an like it's an anomaly. You look at the UFC, and the UFC is not like it used to be. You know, also another thing post USADA is the standard of competition in the UFC's got a lot lower. You know, back before USADA, even right down on the prelims, every fight night card was quite a high level of technique on display, whereas now you do see quite a lot of low level guys coming into the UFC. So you would think that in these fights where you've got low level guys up against low level guys, you would see a lot of strange finishes, you would see a lot of strange performances, but really you don't. So then when you go and watch promotions like Bellator and Rising and you see these really strange finishes to fights, it really stands out and it becomes glaringly obvious there's something strange going on. So I watched a fight between earlier this week when I was researching Bellator, Darian Caldwell and Horiguchi's first fight,
Hmm.
and it just looked fixed. It just looked like, it just looked like an illegitimate finish to a fight that you would never see in the UFC. You would never see a strong NCAA Division One level wrestler allow themselves to be caught with a guillotine in
Yeah,
someone's full
that
guard.
was
It was so strange.
that was I didn't have time. I don't have time to watch the whole fight and and analyze it. So I trust your opinion on this. I looked at the finish, and the finish was definitely like it was the slowest
Yeah.
creeping setup ever. Like if you're in somebody's butterfly guard, which is their open guard, they're two steps from full guard. You just don't stick your head in like this and stay. And when the person wraps your neck, you drop everything and defend your neck. You don't just kind of sit there and let him wrap your neck and take his time to adjust and then sit back into full guard to finish the guillotine. So yeah, that did look strange. So let's put our let's put this out there and on the line. If that fight was fixed, right, then what I think is happening is that uh, Ryzen or Bellator or one of these guys, they want a trilogy, right? This is what they would want. So Darian Caldwell should win, and he is the favorite
Hmm.
tonight, which is
Hmm.
odd, which is odd to me because Kyoji Horiguchi has, I mean, he's undersized, and I didn't do the research of the fight, so I don't want to say too much, but if we are correct in that the fight is fixed, then Darian Caldwell should win in some strange manner tonight. So we will we
Hmm.
will we will see how that goes for our prediction.
Yeah.
So and I agree. Like that fight was weird. It was a strange thing. You also mentioned before to me in the chat about like Chael, and I have to agree with his losses are just so strange. Getting, I mean, even from the days of him getting triangled by Anderson to jumping over Fedor, doing that front flip
That
to
was the strangest part. That jump when he had control of Fedor's back. I'm not sure if this is a term you have in America, but over here it would be called like a roly-poly, where you like roll forward. It was
yeah.
just, why would he? I've never seen
So here's the weirdest part.
anyone do that.
Here's
I've
the
never seen
weirdest part
anyone do
about
it.
that move. Okay, that move is a very very risky jiu-jitsu move, and he's basically trying to connect his hands in a seatbelt and roll Fedor over into his lap, right? But it doesn't make any sense. Fedor is bigger than him. That's definitely not a wrestling move. That's a jiu-jitsu move. I think like Leo Vieira, jiu-jitsu black belt, made that move famous. And you don't do that against somebody bigger than you, first of all. Secondly, as a wrestler, you just don't do that. That doesn't make any sense. Like as a wrestler, you hold them. You're trying to hold them down to score. You wouldn't roll them over into your lap like that. That's a pure like this is a jiu-jitsu move and very risky. So yeah, that was so strange. And that's the one other thing. The last thing I'll say about uh, fixing fights and this type of stuff is that it only needs to be from one side, right? Like only
Hmm.
Chael needs to know. Fedor doesn't need to know. He just needs to
Yeah. Well, we
slap his
saw
face
that with
off.
Tai Hyung Bang, you know?
Yeah, his opponent didn't know. Yeah, it was just
He didn't have
one-sided.
any clue.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so yeah, that was awesome. I just wanted to get your opinion on that because I don't think a lot of people that uh, maybe even people that bet on MMA, they're not thinking about potentially fights being fixed and just steering clear of potentials like that, right? Because I'm
Hmm.
looking at this fight between Caldwell and Horiguchi, and Horiguchi is a good bet. I think he's got a good record. He's got ways to win. But then just the thought of the fight being fixed, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do that. So
Definitely.
yeah. So
Can I just pop in my
yeah.
settings
Go
again?
go go ahead.
That was
Yeah
quite a nice clean cut, though, I think.
yeah.
I'll just pop these in. Backups.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right.
I'll just connect them now.
Okay.
Just 2 seconds.
So while Chris connects those AirPods.
There we go. We're back. Sorry about that, guys. We are back.
All right. So sorry to anybody that got some weird noise in their head just now. That was just Chris changing out his AirPods. And Chris, are we good on time? It's about 4:30, so the live betting Bellator starts in like 2.5 hours, I think. We're
Oh,
still
yeah.
good. We're
Perfect.
still
That's
good.
great. Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So just moving on here. Another question I wanted to ask you was you mentioned this a lot. Fighters making their debut. Is there a criteria you have? Is there a statistic saying that, maybe stay away from them? Octagon jitters, any criteria for fighters making their debut in the UFC, for example?
Yeah, I think so. There's a book you can check out called Fightnomics, and I'm pretty sure there's a stat in there. The fighters that make their debut lose around 65 to 70% of the time. If it's not in the book, the author of the book, Reed Kuhn, you can check him out on Twitter. He has posted that statistic after the fact. So he works for, if you go to UFCstats.com, Reed Kuhn helped develop kind of like the measurement system where they measure like significant strikes, or they're able to quantify MMA by the numbers. So if that stat isn't in the Fightnomics book, he's posted it and shared it after the fact that they've been able to like measure that data based on the information that they captured from fights. So UFC debutants lose around 65 to 70% of the time, and a much higher percentage when they make their debut on short notice.
Which a lot of fighters do make their debut on
Mm-hmm.
short notice. I'm just trying to think of examples off the top of my head. I can only think of the examples of like the fighters who have been successful after making their
Hmm.
debut and winning, like people like John Jones, Chris Weidman, stuff like that. But
Hmm.
but I'm sure there's a ton of them that just you don't think about because they lost, and then they probably
Yeah.
lost again and they're gone. So you don't
Hmm.
hear from them. So yeah, that's a big number. So that
Hmm.
obviously factors into how you place your bets, right? So if you had a fighter that you were big on coming into the fight, but they're making their debut, would you would hesitate to bet them or depending on the circumstances?
Yeah, no matter how good someone is, I would almost never bet on a fighter when they make their debut. The only time I'll make an exception, and it still costs me money sometimes, I can give some examples of this. The only time I would ever consider betting on a debutant is they have to have come in on a full camp, or they have to come from a really high level gym where they're training with amazing fighters every single day of the week, or they have to be like a champion or a high level competitor in another aspect of sports, so that when they come in, the bright lights, the cameras, they're not as big a deal for them. It's not like they've just been fighting in a high school gym or a small regional promotion with no experience of being on TV, octagon announcer, high profile weigh-ins, that kind of thing. So to give you examples though of how it can work and how it can't work, some of the fighters that I bet to make their UFC, some fighters I bet when they made their debut this year were Mike Grundy. So the reason why I was happy to bet Mike Grundy as at making his debut was because he had competed in the Commonwealth Games in freestyle or Greco-Roman wrestling for the UK. So he had a lot of experience competing on a big stage. He was training for the Olympics, that kind of thing. And the other one was Ariane Lipski, because she was the strawweight champion in KSW, or flyweight champion, I'm not sure, strawweight or KSW, strawweight or flyweight. In KSW, they get, they do bigger shows than the UFC. They get way more people watching them in arenas, and it's massive in Poland. So I thought she'd be able to handle the big fight experience. Now, what's interesting is Mike Grundy came out and put in the performance of his life, looked better than ever, whereas Ariane Lipski looked a complete shadow of herself, looked absolutely nowhere near as good as she did in KSW, which is kind of like two examples of how it's risky, because Mike Grundy's a guy that rose to the occasion and performed excellently and won his debut. Ariane Lipski looked very poor, significantly underperformed, looked nowhere near as good as what we've seen from her in KSW. So that's why it's risky to bet on debutants, no matter how favourable their situation is coming into the UFC.
Right, right. That's a good point. I think that's if anybody gets just one thing out of this, that's probably a good piece of advice right there. And I'll be honest, I bet on Gracie on his UFC debut. It's again emotional, just attachment to jiu-jitsu guys for
Yeah,
obvious reasons.
yeah.
All right. So this is, I guess, more of a beginner question, but besides subscribing to your monthly subscription service, which is excellent, by the way,
Oh,
what
thanks a lot.
what would you recommend first time MMA bettors do in general just to get started?
So I think that if I was starting out, I would just try and encourage people to not listen to people who you may think know a lot about the sport. So steer away from fighter opinions, steer away from, MMA journalists will give their picks and stuff on their websites. A lot of people put breakdown videos out. I would say steer away from all that, because you don't want your opinion to be swayed by other people. You want to have conviction in your own decisions. You want to find your own way. And I think it's way more important to develop like a gambling mindset and an ability to gamble effectively than to focus on MMA. So if you were just starting out as an MMA bettor, I would just say don't focus on MMA. Go read books on investment, how to manage money. Look at how investors approach growing their money and investing in whatever they invest in. Could be anything: businesses, startups, stocks and shares. Just learn how different investors grew their wealth. So obviously every investor's got very, very different strategies. So if you look at someone like Peter Thiel or Jason Calacanis, they will have a very different investment strategy to someone more conservative like a Tony Robbins or a Warren Buffett. So look at everyone's strategies around money management, because you need to look at fighters like a commodity that you're betting on. You are putting your money on a fighter and expecting them to perform in a certain way. Just like if you buy a stock or share, you're expecting that business to perform in a certain way, which would bring you a return on that investment. So learn how different investors handle their money, learn about the psychology of how they approach things. And then I would just try and gamble as much as possible, because it's like anything in life. You get good at something through repetition. And unfortunately, it can be very expensive to get good at gambling through repetition, because obviously the more bets you're placing, the more chance you've got of losing. And the problem with sports betting is obviously whenever you bet or place a bet on a sport, you can lose that bet in an instant. You can get through a lot of money very quickly. So what I would recommend is taking up a sport, or I call it a sport, maybe a game like online poker, where if you look at online poker, you can play for an enormously long amount of time for a very low cost. So for example, you could pay $5 or $10 or even $1 to buy into a multi-table poker tournament, which could last like 10 or 12 hours. So you will gain a lot of experience gambling and managing a pot of money without actually physically losing too much cash, which would have a big negative impact on your life. Because it's like anything, you have to get good through reps. You don't want to get good betting on a sport and getting crushed and losing before you have developed gambler mindset. So online poker is a great way to do that. So, because online poker will humble you. I think that a lot of people assume that they know a lot about MMA, and they have very strong opinions on how fights will play out. And if they pick a fighter to win and he wins, they'll think they were right. And if someone picks a fighter that lost, they'll think they were wrong. But poker will teach you that that is a really flawed and limited way of looking at things, because in poker, you could be in the strongest position imaginable and still lose. You know, odds defying, probability defying, logic defying beats. You've done everything right, and life will still punch you in the face.
Get rivered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that it really humbles you. It breaks you down, and it makes you realize that having a strong opinion is really dumb, because anything can happen. And as soon as you train your brain to thinking like that, it enables you to brush off losses very quickly, so you don't worry about tilt and getting angry and chasing and placing dumb bets. It's really, really valuable. Like online poker is a great way, I think, to gain that experience. And you can do it cheap. I mean, you can buy into tournaments for like $1, and you get 8 or 10 hours of experience gambling. You'll learn much more from that than placing sports bets. So then when you do then start to place sports bets, you will know how to manage a pot of money, because whenever you play a poker tournament, you've got to manage your chip stack. It's the same kind of thing, whether an investor is managing their investment portfolio, or a poker player is managing his chip stack, or a sports bettor is managing his betting account balance. It's all the same thing, and that's why that is why I don't believe in units. And I think units are a silly system, because if you are using the traditional betting unit system, what it means is a massive percentage of your capital is tied up gathering dust. Whereas if you look at any aspect of finance, you want your money working for you. You want as much of your money out there in the battlefield bringing you a return. You wouldn't hear about, an investor having 90% of their investment portfolio in cash and only 10% in property or commodities or stocks and shares. They that want all their money out there, diversified, focusing on trying to bring a return to them. So while I understand you do need to ensure you don't have too much money at any one time risked on the table where you can lose everything, you definitely need to be more aggressive and have ways that you can commit more of your money, because otherwise your money's just lying around in betting accounts gathering dust. And poker will help you learn playing, multi-table tournaments where you're dealing with deep stacks. It will allow you to get used to, I guess, getting comfortable with a safe amount of risk at any one time. So you're not leaving yourself overly exposed where, one loss could completely wipe you out. You're getting used to kind of how much money can I commit at any one time without crushing myself, basically.
I see. That's great advice.
So that would be my
practicing, just
yeah.
managing your emotions. I guess that's definitely. So I back in like 2000, I think like 13, 14, 15, when I was gambling a lot more on MMA, I didn't see things the way I do now, and a lot of that is thanks to you. But the way I see it now, and I think this would help the people listening, is I don't see it like money, right? I just kind of see it as a game, and by seeing things as a game and having secondary reasons for betting on fights, like learning how to manage money, like learning from your mistakes, like learning things, many things can happen, and also this is just my personal thing is I do some writing for some MMA sites, so I use that to I use the I have to watch all the fights anyway, and so as I'm watching them, I'm making a little bit of money, and I'm writing down some notes as to what I'm gonna write for Monday morning. So yeah, I think that was a great, using poker. I never really thought of that because I used to play poker too. I used to play a lot of Texas Hold'em, and that was the one thing I never got into a lot of was like tournaments. I always played. Maybe this kind of tells you who I am as a bettor, but I only played limit poker. I only played like 8-16 limits because I knew that I know what I have in my hand, right? I know what I have, and I know what you possibly can have, and I know you can only take me for this amount of money. So I just get in the places that I'm the strongest, and usually I would win, and that's kind of like how I managed tilt, I guess. When I played no
Hmm.
limit, I would always get tilted because I
Hmm.
just didn't. Uh, I make a bet thinking I have the best hand. Somebody go over the top all in on me, I'd be like, mother, Jesus,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able
Yeah.
to control that. So yeah, just practice and also, I mean, this isn't a bad idea, right? Just subscribing to your site and just following your tips. You don't have a cap on your monthly subscription, right? Just on the elite
Yeah.
membership. Okay, great. So then
Yeah.
just do that. Just do that. Then you're
Yeah.
doing the thinking for people so that
Hmm.
they don't have to, like there's no way I work like 50 hours a week. There's no way that I could watch even half of the fights that are happening tonight. I can't even watch one fight. I mean, one fight
Yeah.
could take you 20 minutes, right? It's
Hmm.
a full on 5 round, 3 round fight. You could
Hmm.
spend 20 minutes just watching one fight, so
Hmm.
so yeah, you're doing the work. Um, all right. Let's see here. So I have a couple questions from people in the chat as well as on my Instagram that people have asked, and one of them is what is the hardest thing about MMA betting, and what is the easiest thing?
So the hardest thing is having a skill that you've spent many, many years developing, you're not able to use to its fullest. So I, what we were talking about, where poker is a great way to learn how to manage tilt because you go through repetitions. And now I don't tilt; I can shake off losses really fast, and it doesn't. You've probably seen that with the live betting.
Right,
We can take a really bad loss, and then straight away we get back on the horse and come back with a profit. So
right,
tilt doesn't affect me. But I've been betting on MMA for like 10 years now, and still every time a betting website limits my account or shuts me down, I just get really angry. It just annoys me because it's kind of like they're forcing you to play a game that only you can win. If you lose consistently, they would be happy for you to, lose relationships, lose your house, lose your car. Gambling destroys people's
right.
lives. And
They
as
want
long
you to
as you're
play a
losing,
game. They want you to
mm,
play a game that only they can win, right? That only they can
exactly.
win. You can only lose.
Yeah.
And if you start
Yeah.
winning, they're going to shut down your account, or they're going to limit your account so you can only bet like $25. And this is
Exactly.
this is very so I've never experienced this because I'm on US sites and I don't bet the amount that you do, but this is very common, I'm assuming.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, were you in the live? I know it's not the best for us to talk about this because people can't really visualize what it's like. But remember a few weeks ago, I recommended a live bet, and like 10, 15 of us got shut down at the same time. Can you
Oh,
remember? Were
really?
you in there a few
Yeah,
weeks
yeah, I
back?
think I think I was. What was it? Was there a specific fight that this happened on?
Yeah, I think it was we bet someone to win by decision. I can't remember who it was. It was on the Kevin Lee Dos Anjos card. It was a few
Okay.
fights before the main event, and we bet someone. If you, and like 10, 15 people were shut down all at the same time.
Okay,
Can't remember who it was.
let me look it up. But so basically, shutting down is the same as being limited, or are you using those terms interchangeably? So
Yeah, it's tricky because different betting websites do different things. So some of them will restrict the amount of money you can bet. So they'll limit you. They will limit you to very, very small bets like $5, $10. But other betting websites will just straight up not allow you to bet anymore. I've got a YouTube video coming out about this soon where I've kind of done a video showing screen capture of what happens when your account gets shut down. And I've got two different examples showing like the differences between what different websites do, so that people will kind of have an idea of why it's so frustrating. So that's definitely the worst part. It's annoying because I know, like, I would love to give all my content away for free. I would love to just be able to bet freely, just like anyone else. Like I can't like place a bet on my mobile phone because this mobile phone's blacklisted. So if I'm watching a sport, I can't just fire an app up and place a bet because it's
wow,
blacklisted. So I've always got to have new devices to use.
blacklisted,
And I
like they
should.
ban your IP or something like that. That's what you mean?
So they can basically detect the component serial numbers in a device.
Wow.
So that if you were to try and log into another account on a betting site from the same device, they would recognize that this device has been used by someone that's cost them money before, and they would shut you down even before you could place a bet. So it's very frustrating because you have a skill that you can't use. Like I would love to just be able to be, watching some UFC fights, placing bets on my phone. It's so hard. It's just a
Yeah.
constant uphill struggle,
I think you wouldn't
Very
have that
frustrating.
problem if you somehow lived in Vegas, I guess, right? Would you still have that problem if you were physically going to the well, the thing is with that is you can't live bet in casinos, can you? So that's a problem too.
No.
So there's just so many things. Yeah, so that's so weird that they shut you down like that just because you're winning. Like I mean,
The good,
yeah. Go ahead.
the good thing is you can, even with the limitations of getting shut down, you can still earn enough money to make a living. There's no doubt about that. But there's just no security. So, for example, if you were to go on like a 6-month losing streak and you've got no money coming in, it doesn't matter what type of lifestyle you lead. If you've got no money coming in for 6 months, it's very difficult. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you were able to earn, if you knew you were able to earn not an unlimited amount of money per betting account, but say, for example, you knew that you were able to just bet freely on fights with no restrictions, it wouldn't matter that you would go on 6-month losing streaks because eventually you're going to turn it around and you're going to be able to make money. The problem is with the restrictions, after, say, in the 7th month when you're profitable again and you start to do well, you could get shut down within making $1,000 worth of profit. Do you see what I mean? And then you're back to square one. So there's just no security there. You can definitely make enough money living, but you're constantly worried about the future because you never know when you're going to get shut down.
Jeez. How do you get around that? How do you get, so if you've been shut down from one site, do you just create a new account, or is there other, how do you get around that?
So there's this thing called Nieman where you would basically get people to open up an account for you and you would use kind of like their details to bet on their account. So that's basically the only way around it.
Okay, I see. What was that called again?
And so for anyone that wants to research this, it's called Nieman. So it's GNOMING. But it's
and
a really
you'll
big
come out with a video with this, right? On your YouTube channel.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really like to produce too much. Like, it's not illegal to do that at all. But I just don't know if it's that appropriate for me to like create content around this. It's like it's not illegal to know at all. I mean, if anything, you could argue that it was more illegal for betting websites to close you down when you make a profit, because they at least in the UK, the legislation around gambling law and the way gambling companies have to conduct themselves is very, very strict. They've got very strict ethical guidelines. And I strongly believe that the way the betting sites conduct themselves, shutting people down, does actually go against gambling law in the UK. But the problem that we've got is only such a small percentage of people ever make money from gambling, that there aren't enough voices to make a difference and drive change. So it's one of the reasons why I set up my YouTube channel, because I'm just sick of it and I want to draw attention to it, and I want as many people to know about it as possible. And hopefully, if a lot of people find out about the way they conduct themselves, maybe one day we'll get a change. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a one-way street, right? You can lose as much as you want, but the second you win a large amount, they shut you down. That's crazy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I never even knew about that until, I met you. So that's
Mm-hmm.
crazy. And hopefully they do something about that in the future, at least in the UK, or in places where people are getting shut down. Um, let's move on. I just have a couple more questions, and I think we're just about getting to the point where we got to go live bet the Bellator fight tonight. Um, this is a question from the chat. When you started your website, I think I know when you started your website because there was only like one other guy, and there was also some just random blogs. And when you started your website and you started selling your picks, or not really your picks, but your bets, right? It's better than picks. Picks are just whatever, bets. Um, did anybody give you backlash? Was there backlash? Did anybody say anything? Did it make you question, if you're doing the right thing? Was there anything like
Mm-hmm.
that?
Yeah, like even now to this day, I get a lot of backlash, or you get called a fraud and a shill, a scammer, all this kind of stuff. Because it's a fair question people ask. If you are able to make so much money from gambling, why would you need to sell your betting information? Like, it's a legitimate question. It's a great question. But again, I don't think people understand how difficult it is to continuously make money without getting shut down. It's very,
Right.
very difficult. There's no security there. And you have to think as well, if you are making a living from gambling and you are only making money from gambling and bets you've placed, it doesn't allow you to live a normal life. So, for example, you can't get a mortgage, you can't get credit, because no lender is going to allow you to take out any form of credit or mortgage if your income's from gambling, because it's not taxable income, it's not a legitimate income. So there are all kinds of reasons why you would do it. So by having the business and generating an income through the website, it allows me to lead a semi-normal life. So instead of having to rent houses, I can buy my house because I'm credit worthy. I could buy a car on credit. I can do whatever I want, because the reality is people assume that professional gamblers are these people that can walk into a casino or a betting shop with a couple $100,000 in their bag, put it on the counter and say, I want to bet on Renato Moicano this weekend. And reality is, the betting sites or the betting shops would just be like, who the hell are you? There is no way we're going to allow you to place that bet. So yeah, it's one of those things where I do get a lot of backlash, but the way I look at it is, like, guys like you that see the benefit in it. For all the people that think it's a scam and I'm a fraud and I'm a shill and all this kind of stuff, like, I know that I'm helping a lot of people make a lot more money than they would without the service, and that makes me feel great. Like, I just love that. It's brilliant, because you can earn a hell of a lot more from the service than what it costs,
Yeah.
And another thing that I say to people is, if the reason why our win rate is so high, the reason why we make so much money, particularly in live betting, is because I'm able to sit at home all day, work my ass off researching fights so that we know we are always getting our money into strong positions. If I didn't have the constant security of a regular income, because I never know when a betting site's going to shut me down, never know how much I'm going to make from a betting account, because they can limit you at any time they want, I wouldn't be able to put as much money into or as much time into my research. I'd have to have kind of like a safety net, another income. Do you see what I mean? Whereas the website allows me to be all in. So the service that people get is next level, because literally every single minute of the day I'm sat here watching fights, doing my homework, because it's difficult to research fights full time. It's really time consuming. So yeah, I do get a backlash, but I think I've just got over it. Like, there's, that with the membership spots are full now. A lot of the guys in there have been with me for years now. So if it was that bad, I'm sure they would have left. So
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
only
Well,
reassurance I need,
I can tell you that, I originally was a member of the just the regular betting service, pre-fight bets, right? And I liked it, and then I just looked at the elite membership, and I was like, that's not that much money. If I learn something, then I'm happy. And I think even if money was not on the line, um, I would be relatively happy paying, what it was, like 199 a month, to just hear you talk about the fights. I feel like that alone is really valuable. And people who
Oh,
who who
thanks.
really respect MMA, that want to know how, just get a different perspective on how MMA works, they would benefit a ton from it. And that kind of sucks for you that you can only put in this amount of people, because imagine if you got big and 2,000 people wanted it to be in, then you wouldn't really have to even bet the fights, right? You can just make sure that other people are making
Hmm.
the money, and that would be cool. But we already talked about this. The liquidity just isn't there. That's why you can only have 30, 35 or something like that members, right? So
Hmm.
that does kind of suck, but it's I'm happy because it keeps it kind of a small circle, I guess. So that's good. All right, so a couple more. We already talked about. Oh, this was one we didn't get to. What are the biggest mistakes you see? Like, so there's obviously a lot of other people who offer tips, right? And I've been a part of those groups too. And I don't know what it was. It was just, it wasn't even that their tips were bad or anything was wrong with their service. It was just, I like to critically think everything, so you kind of give me that. You describe things in a detail that makes me think, okay, this guy can't be a con artist, because he can't be a scammer, because if he's a scammer, he wouldn't say what he just said right now. It wouldn't, that would give away everything. So he
Hmm.
has to have integrity. He has to know what he's talking about. So I I just kind of want to throw out a general question. What are the biggest mistakes you see people who sell tips make? And even people that don't sell tips, they just kind of offer advice. What's the biggest mistake you see when it comes to betting MMA?
Yeah, I say I can't really speak for other people because I don't really. Again, it goes back to a little bit of what I said about things that new people betting MMA should do and just drown out the noise and just focus on you. So I don't really know about too many other tippers and the way they do things, because if I listen to other people's opinions, confirmation bias is difficult to deal with. So you want the least amount of, if you know that you can make money betting on MMA, you want the least amount of other people's opinions possible, because what you're doing works and you can't trust that other people that you've listened to have done the homework. Does that make sense? You just
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
focus on you.
Yeah, the only exception to that, I feel like, is if there were people out there that were doing the research, would you want to hear from them if they were doing the research? Kind of like, if you knew for sure, and I guess there's no way to verify, right? But just hypothetically, if you knew that they were doing the same amount of research as you or more, would you kind of would you allow them to enter your headspace then at that point, just to get another viewpoint, or would you still rather be in your own head, just kind of knowing, be have conviction in your picks?
Yeah, I think it would depend on like the way that the information is presented. So even now with my YouTube videos, it's not as good as I want it to be. So when you look at like Dan Hardy's Inside the Octagon videos, it's like it's a massive part of my research. Like I absolutely love his Inside the Octagon videos because of how detailed they are. And with the fight footage that he uses, you can see exactly the points that he's trying to make, exactly what he's seen, and that's really valuable. But when it comes to just people talking, I prefer to like see in the footage. I think the footage is the most important thing. The camera doesn't lie. It will tell a very honest story of what we can expect. So if it was presented in a way like Dan Hardy presents it, then definitely. But just talking, it's difficult because you can't trust that they've seen what is true, I guess. When Dan Hardy points out a specific sequence or technique and he breaks it down with footage,
Yeah,
it's indisputable. It is there. But when
right.
someone just talks, it's just an opinion. Do you see what I mean?
They might have
And
pulled
that's
up
why I wish that I
Wikipedia.
could, like,
They might have just
exactly.
pulled
That's
up
why I wish that
Wikipedia.
I could use. Yeah, that's why I would love to be able to use fight footage in my YouTube videos, and I do in promotions outside of the UFC. Obviously, I can't use UFC footage. I think it would just be amazing, because what you find now is I'll give like a really detailed breakdown on a fight, and loads of people will disagree with me. But I think if they could just see what I had seen, do you know what I mean? If I could show them with footage what I had
Yeah,
seen,
yeah.
it would
Then
be much more difficult.
you wouldn't get somebody saying like, you know, ah, Tony's gonna KO Cowboy for
Mm,
sure because he's hasn't
hmm
lost in the last 2 years, and Cowboy,
Exactly.
has been KO'd in the last 2 years. So like that's actually a pretty good example is uh is that fight, right? So the Tony Ferguson uh Cowboy Cerrone fight. That obviously didn't go our way, but you had, I'm not mad at it, and nobody should be if they do any amount of critical thinking, because everything you mentioned in your breakdown of the fight was accurate. It was just accurate, and had the fight not been stopped in the way it did, or had all that stuff happened, I guess there was a momentum swing, but everything that you said could have very well happened. Like in an alternate dimension, it could have happened. Like if they fought 10
hmm
times, maybe 7 times Cowboy gets the knockout, and this happened
hmm
to be the 3 times that Tony, got through. So yeah, that's all in the research, and that's one of the reasons why you know, I trust you, is because you're describing why it's not just he's going to win because he's a better fighter, or something ridiculous, something that has
hmm
no, like, has no real evidence, right? So
hmm
okay, let's talk real quick about and you mentioned this already, but how does your day look? Like what does your day consist of? Like when do you wake up? When do you wake up? What do you do all day? How many hours do you spend? Uh, and like what are you eating? I'm curious. Are you concerned for your health? These things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wake up at probably 8 a.m., take my son to school, come back, sit at the computer all day researching fights, go pick him up from school, come back, make a YouTube video on the fights that I've watched throughout the day. And then that is pretty much it every single day of the week. So busy, very busy, spend a lot of time in front of a computer. So health is a concern. The diet's pretty good. Uh, a few years ago, my wife was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease. So she was like crippled in pain, couldn't walk, in absolute agony, in a really, really bad way. But I've got like quite a, I don't know if it's an obsessive personality, but it's basically, if I am going to do something, like I go all in, I want to learn everything about it. So my wife got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. She couldn't walk. She was in agony. So I started learning a lot about the disease, and went on like pubmed.gov constantly every day. I was spending just as much time researching rheumatoid arthritis as I was researching fights. When I wasn't watching fights, I was researching this disease. I ended up learning so much about it, and it turned out that there were so many things that you could do to control it. So it was like it was a chronic illness. You're supposed to have it for life. There's no cure. You have to go on to really strong medications to control it, and it was basically a death sentence. You're supposed to live your entire life in pain. And I went down a really deep rabbit hole of reading all these medical studies and learning about it. And it turned out that, through stress management, exercise, diet, you can control it. And like 3 years now since she's been diagnosed, it's just gone away. It's disappeared. She doesn't have it anymore. So our diet's pretty good because we do watch what we eat.
Right. Like
Diet's a really big part of it.
do you do like a
Because
anti-inflammatory diet or something like that?
mhm. It's kind of mainly just paleo.
Oh,
If
okay.
it's just if meat, vegetables, and fruit, just keep it real simple. You know,
Hmm. Yeah,
just
so then
yeah.
that's
So
good.
quite
That's good.
strict.
That's what I would
hmm
recommend. So I am a trainer. I am a personal trainer. So that's what I would
Yeah.
recommend if you're not, because you're not, obviously you don't really have time to like go to the gym for 2 hours, right, a day,
hmm
or do jujitsu or something. You got to work. You got to research fights, and you
hmm
have a family to take care of. So yeah, that would be that would be a good diet actually. It's just like kind of like a paleo diet. Just that is low inflammatory, I would say. Just that's
Yeah.
good.
The crazy thing about that food as well is you, like, health issues disappeared. You didn't even realize you had. because you've lived with them for so long. And then all of a sudden, when you change your diet, things change, which is amazing. But yeah, exercise is a real big issue for me at the moment. It used to be okay, but since I started doing these YouTube videos, I've added like an extra, say, 2 to 3 hours a day of work on, and then obviously other things I've had to sacrifice other things to focus on doing the YouTube videos. So I've only been doing the YouTube videos for about 3 months. I need to bring exercise back into my life, but it's just one of those things that is just gone on the back burner over the last few months because this YouTube thing's come along and it's taken up a lot of my time. But it'll just get to a situation where I'll get better at managing my time, and then I can start to do it again. But it's not good. Definitely worry about my health. They say that like office jobs and desk jobs are like the 21st century version of smoking, or like millennials version of smoking. So it is a concern, definitely.
Yeah, definitely for the heart, you need to have some type of cardiovascular activity. That's the thing I'm scared of the most is I sit around quite a lot too, to be honest. I sit around, not really sit around, but I stand around. I'm in the gym training people. I'm not really moving too much, so it does scare me too. But yeah, so I'm glad you have things in place that because I was afraid you're going to sit in front of the computer for 10 hours a day, don't move, eat Cheetos or something and pizza, but that's obviously not what you're doing. So
I used to,
cool.
though. I used to, it's one of those things where you don't. It's the same in every aspect of life, but you don't realize how much attention you need to pay to something until the absolute worst happens. Then you realize, oh shit, I need to sort my life out.
Yeah, that's basically what happens to me on every single thing. So, but yeah, that's I need to get that in order too. All right, let me wrap this up with just one more question. Let's go back to just some of the questions I got and finish this up on betting. So, I've heard you mention this term a lot, and I kind of understand it, and I kind of don't. But compound interest. Um,
hmm
can you describe that?
Yeah, so it's the most important part of gambling. It's the most important. Like, I'm not a wealthy man at all, but by using compound interest, it has helped me make hell of a lot more money than I would have without using the strategy. So it's the fundamental basis for like pretty much every investment book ever written. And the easiest way that I can describe it is, say, for example, you went out and you got 100 t-shirts printed, okay? And you sold those 100 t-shirts at, say, $10 each. So you sell 100 t-shirts, $10. Now you've got $1,000. But they only cost, say, $500 to produce the t-shirts, okay? So what you would do is when you sell, if you made, actually a better example, say you had 100 t-shirts, they cost $5 to make. You were going to sell them for $10 each. You put $500 up front to get the t-shirts made, but when you sell them all at $10, now you've got $1,000. So the next time you go to make the t-shirts, you've got enough money to make 200 t-shirts instead of 100. So then the next time that you sell the t-shirts, you make $2,000 profit or $1,000 profit. And the more money you have to make t-shirts, the more profit you get. And then again, the next stage, you can make more t-shirts, more profit, more t-shirts, more profit. So by constantly reinvesting your profits, you go from manufacturing 100 t-shirts and only making $500 profit to maybe by keep reinvesting your profits, now you can make 1,000 t-shirts at $5,000 profit. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in terms of betting,
yep, go ahead.
the way you would do it is, say you have $1,000 in your betting account. You are betting $100 per fighter. Is like a really simple principle. But every time you win a bet, you are increasing the amount of money in your betting account. So that means you've got more money to risk, more money to place bets with. So if you grind your bet account balance up from $1,000 to $1,500, you'll reach a point where you can afford to bet $150 on a fighter, but it's exactly the same percentage of your total money as when you're betting $100 on a fighter. But you earn more profit then from winning a $150 bet than a $100 bet. So that also accelerates the rate at which your account grows. Do you see what I mean? So it's just like the t-shirt example. When you're making 100 t-shirts, you can only make $500 profit. When you're making 1,000 t-shirts, you can get $5,000 profit, and it snowballs. So you can go from, so say for example, you grind your bankroll up from $1,000 to $10,000. Okay, that's the same percentage gain as going from $10,000 to $100,000 if you use compound interest, because you're just working in percentages. So the way that I use compound interest for betting is, again, this is the reason why I get very annoyed through account limitations, because obviously they limit the amount that you can grow to. But the way that I use it is, say for example, I've got $1,000 in my account and I bet $100 on average per fight. If I were to lose that bet and my account balance was to go down to $900, then the next time, instead of betting $100 on that fighter, I would bet $90. Again, it's the same percentage. And the percentages are really important because it means you've never got too much of a percentage of your total amount of money at risk at any one time. And it works the other way. As you're making profit, if when your account balance were to go up to $1,200, that $100 bet now becomes $120, because the more money you're betting, the more profit you can get, which accelerates the rate at which your bankroll can grow. It's like when you start with anything, any investment portfolio. If you have $10,000, you can't make as much as someone with $100,000. But by constantly reinvesting everything, you can see big percentage gains, and everything compounds and accelerates and snowballs. It's like an avalanche. The more money you have, the more money you can make. And that works for every aspect of life. I think Einstein said compound interest is like the most powerful force in the universe. If you really think about it, when there's always that saying as well, where scared money doesn't make money. And it's really, really true, because when you only have a small amount of money to work with, any decision you make, any financial decision could cripple you. Okay, so say for example, you work a day job, you've got a set income every month, and your friend might come up to you with a really good business opportunity. But if you don't have much money, if that business opportunity fails, that might cripple you. Whereas if you apply compound interest to every aspect of everything you do, including gambling, then you will grow your money and you'll be able to make better decisions in every single aspect of life. So it starts with gambling. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you were to start with $1,000 in gambling and you were to use compound interest to grow it into 10 grand or $100,000, by the time you get to 10 grand, maybe you could take 2 grand out and buy 2 grand's worth of Bitcoin. Maybe you could take 2 grand out and make, a t-shirt printing business you've always wanted to do. At the beginning stage, when you're first starting out, that $2,000 might be unrealistic because you're living paycheck to paycheck and it's not possible to do it. But by using compound interest, you constantly reinvest your profits and grow, so you can take way more opportunities. And I think that's why it's so important to use compound interest for gambling, because if you're just sticking to a traditional unit system, you're never growing. You're always going to be betting $100 a fighter. You're never going to get to the stage where you can bet $1,000 or $10,000. You cannot withdraw money in the early stage. You've got to leave it in to grow. It's so important, and I think it's the most important thing about anything to do with gambling. Because what I always say to people is, if you look at all the top investors, they've all got their cash cow, the thing that makes them money, which allows them to put money into different areas. And gambling can be a very good cash cow. But because of account limitations and max bet limits, there's only so far you can take it. So you've got to have a plan B. And that's why compound interest is really important. Grow until you get to that ceiling, and then just look for other areas to expand.
Okay, that's a really good. That when you describe it that way, it's kind of like it's just common sense, right? But it's crazy how many people wouldn't think about it as like common behavior. They would, maybe bet outside their means or bet too little and then go on tilt and then bet outside their means. That's kind of like how I remember my friends who were betting were doing things. They were using units, and then they would use like 1 unit, 3 unit, 5 unit, and they would lose like a bet that they put 5 units on. They'd chase that 5 units, and the next thing you know, they're down like 25 units. And then that's kind of, I understand. So you're basically saying you shouldn't use units. You should commit a little bit more of your bankroll so that you don't have a large percentage of your bankroll just sitting on the shelf, just collecting
Hmm.
dust and not earning any interest, let alone compound interest. So yeah, it makes a lot
Hmm.
of sense. Um, so
Yeah, and just to
mhm,
just to clear that up as well, because some people would think that that's reckless, but what you've got to understand is by constantly adjusting the amount you bet in, it would take an extremely long time for you to lose everything. Because if you say, for example, had lost $900, you started with $1,000, you were down to 100. If you were sticking to the percentages and you were using compound interest correctly, when you got down to $100, your bet would be $10. If you were to lose that, you'd be down to $90. Then it would take you a very, 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 very long time to lose all your money. So why, losing 10% of your money in an instant might seem extreme. If you're using the correct percentages,
yeah,
it's actually a very, very safe strategy, because it would take an unbelievably bad losing streak to lose everything, in which case you probably won't be a profitable bettor anyway. So you
right,
shouldn't
right,
even be concerned by that. Do you see what I
yeah,
mean? If you lose money, if you lose all your money using that compound interest strategy, you're going to lose all your money whatever strategy you
right.
use. But
It
if you are a
scales.
profitable, yeah, but if you are a profitable bettor, that is the best betting strategy you can use. The only caveat to that is, in order for that strategy to be effective, you have to have a high win rate. So if you have a mediocre win rate, if you're only winning 40 to 50% of bets, compound interest is not for you. You've got to be maintaining a win rate of above 60%. And the reason why that is, whenever you lose a bet, you have to win that amount of money just to get back to break even, and then win another bet, obviously, to get into profit. So with compound interest, what happens is, the faster you go up and you make money, the harder you can come down. So, for example, if you are making, it might take you a long time to grind your money up from $1,000 to $200, $1,000 to $2,000, right? But then if you're betting, say, 10% of your money, that would be a $200 bet when you get to $2,000 account balance, which means the amount you're betting is more substantial, which means the rate at which you can come down is much faster as well. Does that make sense? So if
Yes.
you're committing 20% of your money, say, for example, on bets in a day, you would be committing $400 of $2,000, which means it wouldn't take you very long, probably 3 or 4 bets, to go back from $2,000, which you'd worked your way up to, back to where you started at $1,000. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you're
Yes.
betting with much larger amounts now. So the really important, like the magic bullet behind compound interest, is that you have to maintain a high win rate. And that's why people criticize me, because I don't place that many bets. On average, maybe 1 or 2 bets per event. I like to keep it quite tight in live betting as well. And that's because if you're using compound interest to grow your money, every time you win a bet and you pull that profit back in, that means you can bet more money the next time, and it accelerates the rate at which you can make money. If you've got a low win rate, if you're only winning 30 or 40% of bets, even if the bets you're winning have great odds and the returns are great, it will seriously slow down your compounded interest growth. Because as you grow your money, when you take those big losses, 3 or 4 consecutive losses, that puts you right back to square one. So a win rate is incredibly important. You have to have a high win rate. If you're one of these guys that are betting, placing 8 or 10 bets per event, then you don't use compound interest or you'll get killed, even if you're a profitable bettor. Because on that one night where you lose, 6 of those 8 bets, you might lose 40, 50% of your money in one day, and it's not good. You need
Right,
to
right.
avoid big swings.
I
So
see.
it is a complex topic, but
Yeah.
compound interest is great if you've got a high win rate and you can be profitable.
Well, that's the thing that I've heard you say a lot is, don't put your money into marginal situations. Put your money in
Mm-hmm.
where you have an advantage, or you've done the research, and the likely outcome is what you're betting on, right? It's not you're not you're not one of those guys that puts a, like, say, tonight's Bellator card, right? You're not the type of guy who has to put a bet on every single fight, right? So
No.
you pick specific fights, and that's how you maintain your high win rate, is you put the
Mm-hmm.
fights in which you are in a strong spot to put your money. That's that's
Mm-hmm.
that's genius. I mean, that's not something that's common in betting. When I was around in 2015, people, all they talked about were units. Unit this, unit that.
Yeah.
And so,
If you think about it, though, if you look, this is another reason why online poker is such a great way to learn. Because if you look at like a tournament poker, a format where after a set amount of time the blinds are always going up. So obviously, after as the clock ticks by, the blinds change, and as the blinds go up, you are forced to place larger bets, but you get used to betting the same percentage amount. So say, for example, the blinds are $15 to $20 or $10 to $20 in the very first round of the tournament. In relation to that, you're probably betting $80 to $100. But then as the blinds move up in the tournament format to say $500 to $1,000 small and big blinds, in relation to that, you're then betting $2,000 to $4,000 as an opening bet. But it's the same percentage.
right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a great example.
It's the same percentage. So online poker is such an amazing way to develop a gambler's mindset for so many different reasons, and that's one of them, because tournament poker forces you to bet in a way that it forces you to use compound interest. It does, because if you didn't, you'd get crushed by the big blinds. You'd be betting too small amounts.
Right.
So it's just great for so many reasons.
That's what separates you, I guess, from a lot of other people, is you're looking at it kind of like from an investment point of view, as opposed to a gambling point of view. I don't even think you're gambling a lot of times. You're investing money, and that's really smart. And that's amazing, to be honest. So all right. So are you good on time, by the way, Chris? Because I this tends to happen with me.
I think so.
I just the same as my last podcast with Alan Aragon. I come up with more questions as time goes on. So if you have time,
I think so.
If you have time, I'd like to ask you about two things. All right. The first one is, how do odds really work? Like implied probability, American odds, decimals. I kind of know how to move those numbers around if it's American. But as soon as it gets into the decimal range and the European way of doing things, I'm like, ugh, is there a simple explanation? I got a calculator right here in case if you want to walk me through an example.
So decimal odds, I would recommend that everyone uses decimal odds, because it will allow you to make really quick calculations. And it's super easy. All you need to do is multiply your stake by the decimal number, and then subtract your stake. So say, for example, we are betting 1 unit on Eduardo Dantas tonight at odds of plus 180, but his decimal odds are 2.80. So what you would do is you would multiply 1 by the decimal number of his odds, which is 2.80, and then that would equal 2.80. 1 multiplied by 2.80 equals 2.80. You would then subtract your stake, which would be 1 unit, to give you a profit of 1.8 units. And that's it. So really, really fast way to calculate profit and loss.
Okay. What about
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does for the profit and loss. What about in terms of like implied? Because I hear you using this a lot. Implied, like your probability, which is like an arbitrary number that you've come up with based on research, and then the implied probability, because all the odds imply a probability, right? Like if I say whatever plus 180, right? That's the odds are below 50%, right? So is there a way to calculate that? How do I know what that is, for example?
Yeah, so it's quite a complicated calculation to do that. So I would just recommend, I've got an implied probability calculator on my website, but if you just Google implied probability calculators, there are a lot out there. It's basically a formula, which is tricky. It would be time consuming to do yourself. So I would just recommend using a calculator that would do it for you. Yeah.
Okay. Because that I think is one of the most helpful things on your site, which is you like, for example, somebody that's whatever plus 180, right? I don't know what the implied probability is, but it's probably like 40 something percent, right, or less. So then you give your probability, and that's what you use to kind of see if you have an edge over the bookies, right? You see that's the difference, right? You see the difference.
Yeah, I think that comes back to another example of why a gambler would do much better than an MMA expert, because you're not going to find anyone tonight that knows anything about MMA predicting that Chael Sonnen will beat Lyoto Machida tonight. Everyone's going to favor Machida that knows anything about MMA. So it would be very, very tempting to bet Machida tonight. But it's not until you do the calculation, the implied probability calculation, that you think, actually, that doesn't sound like as good a deal as I thought it was. Because in order to get any value there, I've got to give Machida a 90% chance of winning. And when you see that actual probability on paper, all of a sudden it's not so attractive. And I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. Like with the Ferguson and Cerrone fight, like I would have bet Ferguson if his odds were the same as Cerrone's. You see what I mean? If the odds were the way round, I didn't really care who won. But because Cerrone was a big underdog in what I perceived to be a potentially close fight, that made sense to bet him. But if the odds were the other way around, I would have bet Ferguson. It wasn't like I cared either way, because if you cap a fight like that as a probability of 50%, and the implied probability on one fighter is just 30%, it doesn't matter who wins. You're getting a massive edge over the betting sites. So if you consistently put your money in those positions over the long term, you should make a good profit.
Right.
But the beauty of using decimals, maybe it's just because I've grown up with decimals, but I find it much easier to calculate implied probabilities based off decimal numbers than I do money line, just because naturally, if you think of the base point as being, odds of 2.0, which is dead even odds, which is plus 100, that carries a 50-50 probability. So anything, below, the further you get away from 2.0 to the favorite side of things, like 1.91, 1.80, that indicates that the probability would be greater than 50% because they're the favorite. You would assume a fighter would have greater than 50% chance of winning. When you get into plus odds, 2.10, 2.20, it's less than 50%. So with live betting, it's really important that I can do quick calculations on the spot, so I can look at the odds the betting sites are offering, instantly calculate their probability in my head, and then I don't even at any time have a probability as to what I give a fighter of winning. All I do is I look at the probability that the betting sites are offering up in live betting, and then I just think, do I agree with that or not? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes
It's
a lot
kind
of
of
sense.
just like it's just kind of like do I agree with that or not? And it's really as simple as that. And so it even goes to the point where if I think a fighter is winning and they go in to win, and I look to bet them, I will look at their odds, and sometimes I will see the odds and I'll think they're absolutely crazy. I think there's loads of value on it and they're definitely worth a bet. But sometimes their odds will be so bad that the other guy starts to become appealing to me, because even though I don't think he'll win, sometimes there's so much value on him that it just makes sense to bet him. So again, it really is letting the odds do your work for you, and decimal odds just help you calculate probabilities so much faster. Maybe it's just because I've grown up with them, but
well, I personally have never even seen decimal odds in my entire life until I started going online. I always used money line, like plus 100, minus 270, stuff like that. So yeah, that's awesome, man. I think that was a good explanation of how you use those things. And then if anybody wants to learn how to actually like calculate and switch between, you just go online and just kind of Google, I guess, converting money line to decimal, I think is the way to do it. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, Chris, man. I really appreciate you taking all this time, and I think, judging by what I'm looking at in the chat, is Pico's on right now. Aaron Pico is fighting right now.
Oh, cool.
We should probably get set up at least. And
Sounds good.
So last thing, I will just tell everybody who's stuck around for 2 hours and 40 minutes. First of all, thank you, Chris, for sticking around for 2 hours and 40 minutes.
It doesn't feel like that long. It's gone fast. It's been great talking to you. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
So if anybody wants to just learn more about it, Chris's website is MMABettingTips.com. He has a service. It's $19.99 a month, correct? It's something like that,
Hmm.
and it is worth it. Get it. You will, at the very least, if you don't even bet MMA, get the service because you can read his breakdowns on why he thinks a certain fight is going to go a certain way. And I think even MMA coaches, people that are more in my platform, just do it. Just trust me, it's worth the money. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, Chris. And
Thanks,
is there
Ben.
anything else you wanna say before
No, just
we sign off?
thanks a lot for taking the time to do this, because MMA betting in itself is quite a specific niche, and the things we've been talking about on this podcast are really specific as well. And I'm passionate about all these topics, but most people don't care about this sort of stuff. So it's been great to talk to someone genuinely cares, genuinely interested, to have a good conversation about this kind of stuff. So I appreciate it, man. I really do.
Awesome, man. Thank you. Thanks again.